Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Throne of Heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 51, Fragments. Sneaking into the Kukaki mansion was even easier than Yoriyuki had expected it to be. It seemed like there were far less servants awake at night than at the times she'd visited the place before being exiled, and what few were there didn't pay particular attention to a fly moving around empty rooms. Yoriyuki wasn't surprised. She'd mastered the use of Hakuta to wrap her body in a cloud of insulating emotions such as pride and haughtiness, which damped down the sound coming from her, at least when said sound was only the buzzing of fast-beating wings, and always chose routes that kept her out of direct sight. She was, however, disappointed. She'd taught Byakuya how to keep up proper surveillance in an area with the same amount of effort as she had to Swafon, but unlike her, he didn't seem to be applying those teachings. The one thing that would have normally been an obstacle to infiltration would have been the combination of the holding's size and the disposition of the buildings within. The logic for the placement was, as with all of the 46 noble families, based upon complex consideration about respective ranks and other such nonsense. Luckily, Yoriyuki was both familiar with the twisted logic involved and knowledgeable of the area itself, so getting lost was not a risk for her. It did mean, however, that to check the places she thought would be the most obvious required her to shift between her fly form for sneaking around, and her cat form for checking the various rooms she thought Byakuya could have stashed Rukia's Zanpakuto in. While she had to manipulate her Ryotsu into hand shapes to open cabinets and chests in either form, the fact was that the maximum reach she could extend her Ryotsu from her body was proportional to what form she was into, so a larger form like the cat one was best for the job, while still retaining the ability to hide from passing servants, which she had to do twice during her exploration of the Kukaki's trophy room. Plus, Yoriyuki had to admit to herself, she just liked being a cat. Their combination of innate elegance, natural propensity for stealth, flexibility, and agility were something she enjoyed. What she did not enjoy was the fact that, after a very careful check, none of the rooms she'd checked seemed to be holding the Zanpakuto she was looking for. The Kukaki's trophy room had been her third check. After Rukia's own room and Byakuya's office, she had saved Byakuya's bedroom for last, as she expected him to be in the room, but what she found was that not only was he not there, but the blade was not, either. Given this, Yoriyuki decided to check where Byakuya himself was, as it seemed likely at this point that Ichigo's initial worry, that he would be carrying Rukia's Zanpakuto on his person, was correct. She ended up finding him in a place where she wouldn't have thought to look, the mausoleum that housed the plagues honoring all members of the Kukaki family whose soul had dispersed. The moment she realized this, Yoriyuki berated herself. While the Byakuya she had trained with had been young and never had a particular reason to visit the place that held the memory of his ancestor, in the century since Byakuya had lost both his father and the woman he'd married, Rukia's sister. To find him meditating in a place meant to honor their memory was something she should have expected. As she got closer, she also saw that Rukia's Zanpakuto was placed right in front of the plaque with the name of Hisuna Kukaki, which Yoriyuki knew, from Rukia's tales, to be the name of her sister. This caused Yoriyuki to smile to herself a little. It seemed that, at least to some extent, Byakuya was conflicted about Rukia's situation, perhaps trying to find peace with letting his sister stay in jail. The best thing she could do now was to wait until Byakuya left, hoping he'd either leave the sword there or bring it to a place where she could take it without having to risk a confrontation with her former pupil. However, before she could find a good hiding place, he spoke up, his tone neutral and his emotions wrapped closely about him in a way that made it seem as if he was feeling nothing at all. "I can sense you there, Yoriyuki. If you have come to confront me, do it openly." She didn't, of course, answer to this. While she didn't remember Byakuya ever taking the precaution of occasionally speaking into empty air just to try and make an hidden assassin to reveal themselves, she had explained the tactic to him as one of the basic security measures that could be useful, so it was possible he had just adopted it as a reaction to knowing, from her clash with Swafon, that she was lurking across Suriitai with the aim of freeing Rukia. Besides, she'd made sure to avoid the expanded net of his senses. She had long perfected the ability of using Ho-Ho to make her soul feel like loose Ryotsu in the air to the traditional Shinigami senses, and kept it up as she crossed the range of his perception. She did not believe he could have possibly sensed her. This was proved wrong, however, as he stood up, turning to aim his eyes exactly where she was floating in the air in the shape of a fly, and then let his Ryotsu expand in a straight line directly from his body to her position. While not an attack, it could turn into one easily if she let it pass through her with Ho-Oh without obstruction, and while she could dodge it, Byakuya would likely chase a suspiciously agile fly until he managed to hit it, revealing her for who she was. Seeing as there was little point in trying to keep up stealth, Yoriyuki resumed her human form, using Hakuda to form a hardened shield that blocked Byakuya's Ryotsu, before asking him, feeling genuinely curious. "I admit I'm curious, how did you make me out? Why would that be important? Come on, can't you humor your old teacher? I remember you being the one to make clear to me the importance of concealing the limit of one's own abilities. Would you want me to ignore that teaching now? Are you saying you're afraid of what I could do with that information?" She grinned after saying that. While he didn't look flustered or embarrassed as he would have a century earlier, Yoriyuki still thought that her needling was getting to him. And in fact, this was quickly proved as he answered, dispassionately. "You were too quiet and too stealthy. I didn't perceive a fly, nor could I hear one, yet I saw the reflection of one on the metal plagues in front of me. Is that something you can use?" Yoriyuki chuckled at that. It had been a small mistake, but if nothing else it told her something of how Byakuya had progressed since she'd last seen him. Every bit of knowledge can be useful. It seems you've become much more observant of your surroundings in the last century, haven't you? Byakuya didn't visibly react, but Yoriyuki felt the emotional shroud around him take a clear tinge of annoyance. "Were you expecting me to spend all that time without improving in any manner? Well, considering how you loved to say that skill was the result of natural talent, shouldn't it be surprising?" It was an argument they had gone through very often during the time she'd spent training him as a boy, and Yoriyuki knew that Byakuya's position was that training was still necessary to bring out one's innate potential to be great. However, she enjoyed the way discussing the matter always let him annoyed and out of sort. It seemed, however, that even on that front Byakuya had learned something, given that, despite his Ryotsu revealing a noticeable feeling of frustration, he didn't openly show any reaction to Yoriyuki's provocation. "I doubt that discussing my opinions on talent and training is the reason of your presence here, Yoriyuki. Especially considering that you are currently considered an enemy of Soul Society, which makes me honor-bound to arrest you. So, why are you taking such a risk?" She grinned at that. "It's only a risk if I believe you capable of actually succeeding at arresting me." He didn't seem to react to that at all, merely waiting, while Yoriyuki could simply ask for him to give her Rukia's sword. Now that she was confronting her old student, she wanted to see where he stood about the whole situation, so she said instead, "I wanted to know why you're letting your sister to be executed." While Byakuya's expression didn't change, the shroud of Ryotsu around himself started to let off a clear sense of disdain and disappointment. "It is the duty of the 46 families to uphold the law and customs of Soul Society. If we do not punish those of our own that break those laws, we are unworthy of the role. But I would not expect you to agree that we have such a duty, seeing as, when you were found guilty of conspiracy, you left, rather than stand and take responsibility for your actions." That was enough to leave Yoriyuki a bit annoyed, while Byakuya had no idea what he was speaking about, and thus his disdain was excusable. She really didn't like the idea of being told that she wasn't willing to make necessary sacrifices, when she'd been doing nothing but those for the last 100 years. Thus, there was perhaps a bit of malice in her follow-up question. "And you do not find the situation suspicious at all, do you? It doesn't feel like somebody might be pulling strings in the background, trying to put an innocent to the death to hide their schemes. I am not unaware that you were exiled for attempting to frame Captain Ichimaru. I imagine you want me to believe that this situation is entirely his doing, and not a rather elaborate attempt on your part to once again implicate him for your crimes, so that your exile can be revoked." Yoriyuki frowned at seeing that he didn't look to have been affected at all by her words. "And you've decided that I must be lying? You truly believe, knowing me as you do, that this kind of manipulation is something I would do? Why would you believe that?" That, at least, caused Byakuya to react, if only by shaking his head. "You're saying that I should let my feelings take precedence over what the court of the Central 46 decided, but to do that would deny the value of having a court in the first place. I thought you agreed with me, about the way things are run in Soul Society needing to change." Byakuya's shroud of emotions showed a hint of frustration at that. You know, I had a very similar discussion with Hichibusub just yesterday. I might agree that things need to change, but that doesn't mean I am willing to let our society be destroyed as I seek to achieve those changes, and letting criminals go unpunished would do that. And letting criminals get away with manipulating the system doesn't. Do you think that Aizen's beliefs had nothing to do with why he was murdered, or mine with why I was framed? You just need to trust in our characters, that of myself, and Aizen, and your sister, and act on it. He closed his eyes, and for a moment Yoriyuki thought she could feel warring emotions surfacing within his Ryutsu, but they were quickly replaced by determination as Byakuya said, in a serious tone. The call you're asking me to make is up to neither of us. To act would be to undertake the same abuse of power that the very belief you speak of would want us to change. I cannot do that. Yoriyuki let out a long, pained breath. She had no actual proof of Jin's guilt, and while she was sure that, if she engaged Byakuya in a proper debate, she would be able to change his mind, she had neither the time nor, after the way he was self-righteously puffing himself up as the only one who stood for justice, the will to have it right now. Thus she said, with a shrug. I suppose that's your prerogative. If you can't do what needs to be done, just don't get in my way as I do. Byakuya opened his eyes, while his hand went to the handle of his Zanpakuto as he said. I'm afraid I cannot do that, either. You are still a criminal, to capture you is still my duty, and to let you go would be a stain on the honor of the Kukaki family. Yoriyuki had to chuckle at that. She was the only Shinigami captain to be a grandmaster in both Ho-Oh and Hakuda, and knew Byakuya's fighting style inside and out, having trained him herself. The idea that he could stop her was ridiculous, but then, she supposed that, if he believed in what he was saying, he really had to try. Thus, she gestured encouragingly toward his blade, her words a lazy draw. Come on then, try it, we both know how this is going to go. Byakuya drew his sword with absolute calm, the movement so smooth it made no sound, as he said. You will find that it might not go the way you think it will, Yoriyuki. She rolled her shoulders, getting ready to pounce by using her own Shikai to modify her muscles underneath her skin to have more flexibility and power behind them, choosing the animals she knew best suited for the role, while keeping her outer look still fully human. She had long ago exceeded all the normal requirement for captaincy that, she knew from Rukia's tales, Byakuya had only held for 50 years now. The only thing he had which could surprise her was his Bankai, and while she wasn't going to let him summon that, trashing him in a clash with them both only using Shikai should be enough to satisfy his honor without forcing her to risk inflicting lethal wounds. There was no harm in fishing for information. Is your Bankai that powerful? His expression didn't change, nor did his emotions, no hint of pride or arrogance showing there, only the same determination as before. It is, as it makes me the fastest Shinigami ever, above even yourself, goddess of lightning. But I won't need it to beat you, my Shikai will more than suffice for that purpose. Now scatter, Senbonzakura. As was typical for most mind-type Zanpakuto, Byakuya's sword didn't change in look once released, maintaining its sleek and simple design with a square bronze crossguard and the same lavender hilt. He also didn't do anything like throwing it or otherwise separating himself from the blade to take advantage of his ability to control it from a distance, and so she asked, a hand on her side. And now what? I already know how to defeat that. Even as she spoke, she made sure she was ready to charge if he tried to unleash his Bankai, but Byakuya didn't. Instead, he spoke, the determination in his feelings gaining a slight tone of condescension. You knew, but I have trained since then. I experimented with my blade, for example, to see how it'd react to being broken, and made the discovery that I could control the individual pieces at once, and in fact, I could even force the break to happen, by controlling the blade itself. From there, it was just a process of learning how to control an ever smaller portion of the blade to cause it to separate on its own, and then training myself, so I could control each piece at once. Yoriyuki's eyes widened as Byakuya explained how his training had progressed, and even before he had finished, she was already in motion. At the same time, Senbonzakura simply came apart in a cloud of what looked like glinting petals in front of him, but she knew were actually fragments of the blade itself, and with an imperious and completely unnecessary gesture of his hand he sent them flying in her direction, forcing her to back off as the storm of blades suddenly took a threatening presence. as Byakuya infused them with a desire to cut while at a distance, making each small shard as lethal as the cutting edge of the Zanpakuto could be. As she backed off, Yoriyuki made sure to wrap herself in as thick a cloud of Ryotsu as she could manage, filling it with the isolating feeling of loneliness, since that would both slow down incoming attacks and allow her to run a charge of excitement around the edge if she needed it. Seeing this, Byakuya answered by unleashing his own Ryotsu, and Yoriyuki was surprised for a moment to see that he could deploy it to a range at least 4 times larger than her own, before a more careful look confirmed to her that it was far less dense. It seemed that his constant practice of pushing Ryotsu out, something she'd always chastised him for as just another trapping of his noble heritage he shouldn't let himself be limited by, had been converted by her student in a different form of training. She couldn't help the small smirk that formed on her lips at that, since it was just another proof that she was right, and it was training to make people strong, rather than strength being any type of inborn trait. Then, suddenly, Byakuya disappeared from his position to reappear right next to her, sword in mid-swing and with more of its blade formed. Yoriyuki managed to dodge by using her Shikai to reshape into a bat, letting the blade move above her head while she dashed forward and under the attack, before turning to a pouncing tiger form, but he disappeared again, back to his previous position. That should not be possible. She could tell what he had done. He'd used Ho-Ho to turn his soul from Reishi to pure Ryotsu entirely for a moment, and then recomposed his soul from a different point of his own Ryotsu that he'd spread all over the area, modifying his position at the time of reforming to be in mid-swing rather than a rest position. But she couldn't tell how. The risk with Ho-Ho was always that turning too much of your soul too loose risked losing focus, leading to permanent wounds. A lot had simply destroyed themselves trying to go past half. It should be impossible. Byakuya could see the surprise in her eyes, and the balance of his emotions skewed just a bit more toward disdainful as he said. They made me Ho-Ho Grandmaster for it, so I don't expect you to understand, but if you truly know with full certainty who you truly are, you won't lose your sense of self that easily. That was something Rukia had not told her, which made sense, considering how little the girl liked to brag about anything, but it still left Yoriyuki wanting to scold her for not properly conveying all relevant intelligence. But she pushed the thought away, focusing on the enemy in front of her. Byakuya might have improved a lot and found a way to make his Shikai surpass its own limits, but the ability was still limited to the size of his own sword, meaning that he only had so many blade petals to work with. She used her Hakuta first, giving it a powerful repulsive touch to force his away somewhat, so that he couldn't simply use his trick to appear inside her guard, and then headed for his left side, forcing him to concentrate all of his floating blades there. Then, she used the trick that had earned her the Lighting Goddess nickname, by letting her legs turn into a cloud of riot so that she immediately charged with excitement, converting the very structure of her body into electricity for a moment, which allowed her to move at the speed of lightning for the fraction of a second in which she did. The burst of sudden unmatched speed put her to Byakuya's right side, and she sprung forward and past him, surprising the man, who had been expecting an attack, as her hand instead closed around the scabbard of Sode no Shirayuki. She darted backward immediately, but suddenly, as if from nowhere, she found herself heading for a wall of glinting pink petals. She used her Shikai to turn herself into a dragonfly to be able to dart through while retaining her speed, but even at that size the blades were too many, and in fact seemed to multiply as she went through them, and when she resumed a human form once she was past the barrier, she found herself bleeding from a multitude of different blades. Byakuya didn't look at all fazed by that, even as more and more blades continued to appear, as he commented. You know how feeding more Ryotsu to a Zanpakuto gives it more weight, making it cut better, so long as you keep it dense? And how, if you don't condense it, instead the sword grows in size, becoming impossible to wield? He gestured to the constantly growing blade fragments surrounding them, while the blade in his hand remained the same side and form without change, and went on. I've found that, if I don't condense it but send it to the pieces that already are parted, it just creates more. Yoriyuki couldn't help herself, letting out a small chuckle as she said. So, you're going to concede that training makes you better? Byakuya finally showed a reaction, his eyes narrowing at that, as he answered. What this proves, it's the exact opposite. My training was spent figuring out how to use the infinite potential that was already there, how to do what others had done before, but better. That's what you never understood. What I don't understand, however, is why you're stealing Rukia's sword. Yoriyuki didn't let out her grin, and in fact made it a little bit more impish, even as she slowly breathed out. Unlike most Zanpakuto, the fact that she fused with her own meant that she couldn't really draw Ryotsu from it to heal herself or feed it her own to repair it mid-battle, since the damage they received was the same for both. Thus, taking a moment to recover wasn't a bad idea as she answered. I think I'd rather you be surprised by it. Now, this was fun, but I'd rather run away. You seemed so sure of victory before, but then, I suppose it's not surprising that you would once more refuse to take responsibility for your actions. You never have. For just a moment, Yoriyuki could feel enough rage pulsing inside her to unleash a firestorm on Byakuya and make him see who was the irresponsible one of the two of them, but she'd have been a very poor Hakuta master if she couldn't control her emotions when required. Thus, as the petals started to form a vortex around Byakuya in preparation for swiping after her, she turned and ran, using her ability to turn her legs to lightning again and again until she was sure she was well out of Byakuya's perception range. Letting out another breath, she headed for Yamada's house, as they had agreed she would, to wait for the others to come back from the prison raid. She had done her part and secured the means to find Rukia. Now it was up to them to save enough allies to be able to carry out the rescue out. She was confident that, just like it had for her, everything would go well for them as well. Chapter 52, Dragon. Toshiro knew that he couldn't simply stand still, or he'd just make a target for Jin, but the fact that his Shikai only let him control the ice in direct contact with his sword would limit his ability to counter-attack, since removing the sword from the dragon's body to shoot ice at Jin would leave him, and Momo at his side, as a static target. Or at least, Toshiro hoped, that was what Jin would expect. If nothing else, the traitorous captain didn't seem worried. He aimed his sword toward them, but Toshiro had the dragon moving before the movement was even completed. The way the sword grew was almost instantaneous. He knew this from all the time spent observing Jin in the past, but the man's own movements to aim it were, at least now, slow enough for Toshiro to outpace them simply by keeping his dragon seat moving. His opponent wasn't taking him seriously, and that arrogance was what would cause him to lose. Come on, Toshiro, I know you're better than this. Despite himself, Toshiro couldn't help but feel a sense of strong pride for the fact his former captain, he forcefully reminded himself, could tell he wasn't going all out. However, he didn't let that influence him. Instead, he switched from merely directing the neck of the dragon to dodge the attacks, to instead make it trash brutally with its entire body, both making the dodges more erratic, and thus effective, while finally forcing Jin to start dodging. He could feel Momo tensing behind himself, but he'd secured both of their legs to the dragon's body, so they were at no risk of falling. Meanwhile, he kept his eyes fixed on Jin. The man was dodging merely with small lunges and hops that left him too close to the ground for what Toshiro was planning, but when he finally jumped backwards and upwards to avoid a trashing tail strike, Toshiro generated a lot of new ice within the body of his creation, while making the dragon open the mouth so that the blast of ice erupted outwards, aimed straight at Jin in a moment where Toshiro was sure he wouldn't be able to dodge. And he didn't. He did, however, swung his sword. Toshiro wasn't worried. The amount of ice was far too much to be simply blocked, and even if he managed to parry a portion of it away somehow, far more would continue after the parry and slam into him anyway. Or at least, that was what Toshiro had expected to happen. What happened instead was that, as Jin's Zanpakuto slashed through it, the ice was repelled backwards and sideways, as if a brutal wind was erupting from the blade and pushing it away. Toshiro was left surprised by that for a moment, which gave Jin the time to land and look up at him with a grin and a sharper smile than usual. Wondering how I did that, Toshiro? Well, I suppose you never did earn your Zanjutsu mastery, did you? He hadn't, and knew that. Was it some form of imposition that Jin had been using, somehow? Toshiro knew that to prove true mastery was to be able to show the ability to instigate at least two states on a Zanpakuto, generally the will to cut and the will to block, but maybe a way existed to impose a will to parry instead. He might never have heard of such a thing before, but Jin was the Grand Master, he would know best. Toshiro pushed the thought away, refocusing on Jin, but the silver-haired Shinigami didn't give him the time to react, his sword long enough to cross the entirety of the prison's courtyard as he slashed repeatedly, each strike not merely cutting through the ice, something Toshiro could have counteracted easily, but instead sending the severed fragments scattering with every swipe. The whole attack went by so rapidly that Toshiro had to make his ice dragon grip the prison's roof, as so much of its body had been removed in less than a handful of seconds that it had almost collapsed. He was ready to resume the evasive action. What he didn't expect was for Jin's sword to suddenly grow longer still, punching through the walls of the building underneath and then striking in an ascending swing that caught him by surprise and would have certainly managed to wound him if a hand hadn't grabbed him by the back of his clothes and dragged him in a quick descent. Toshiro blinked as his eyes moved to Momo, who was waving her hand to create small round Kido shields aligned horizontally one after the other, using them as platform to slowly jump downward as they went. She glanced at him, and said, determination in her voice despite the tears still visible in her eyes. Let me help. Momo, you don't even have your sword. I can still fight. If you keep trying to protect me instead of focusing on him, you'll lose. Toshiro grimaced, unable to tell her she was wrong. He'd be able to be more mobile if he only had to focus on keeping himself away from Jin's sword, rather than both. He nodded, but clearly Momo was able to sense that he wasn't fully on board, as she grabbed him by the shoulder and said, a pleading tone in her voice. It's what we promised, that we'd change things together. They had. Toshiro could see his resolve hardening at that, and was about to answer, when he felt a sudden sense of dread about to befall them, and threw himself to the side, dragging Momo with himself. It sent them off course from Momo's controlled descent, resulting in both of them smacking into the ground with a roll that bleed off most of their momentum, but still left them hurt and out of sorts. They had, however, managed to avoid being speared by Jin's blade, which was currently still extended above them, the blade lodged in the wall behind them. The man's grin was particularly amused, even as he waved with his free hand and commented, his tone friendly. You really should be more careful, stopping mid-battle for a pep talk can have harmful consequences. Toshiro got up to his feet, seeing Momo doing the same a few meters to his left, and took advantage of Jin's sword being immobile to aim his sword straight at him and fire as powerful a blast of ice as he could manage. Jin dodged by jumping high, but Toshiro was ready to swipe his sword upwards so he'd catch him in the blast anyway, except that Jin did something Toshiro wasn't expecting. He shrunk his sword but, rather than the blade returning to his hand, he was carried to the place where the tip was lodged inside the wall, the movement faster than any Shunpo could have been and placing him at the completely opposite side of the battlefield. Momo was on it even before Toshiro could turn, sending a dozen of glowing gold arrowheads at Jin with a few waves of her sword and calling the Kido name, but Jin shortened his sword some more, normally this time, so that it no longer was holding him up the wall, the fall giving him enough speed to dodge downwards. Momo gestured, and the arrowheads changed course with a soft curve to chase him, but the moment his feet were on the ground, Jin swiped with his sword in just a manner to make the arrowhead continue to curve, so that they were flying back toward Momo instead, forcing her to summon some Kido shields to stop them, her eyes wide in surprise and panic. Toshiro hadn't left his friend's help go to waste, however, as while he turned he swiped with his blade at Jin, creating an ice dragon along its path and then blasting it forward with another of his ice beams, shooting the massive construct straight at his enemy. The goal was to crush him, and Toshiro was sure Jin wouldn't be able to move his sword fast enough to intercept the attack. However, once again, the man proved him wrong. He shrunk his blade to so little that it seemed to disappear, and Toshiro found that doing so allowed his enemy to move his arm just a fraction faster than he had before, as if the lack of weight in the blade had given the arm a burst of acceleration. Still, the attack was en route to smash into him as Jin's sword grew again, piercing into it and sending huge shards of it scattering all over. Then he crouched, letting the portion of the attack he hadn't be able to disperse to crash above his head, and Toshiro realized his enemy had aimed the sword low specifically to do this. His grip on his sword tightened, annoyed at how Jin seemed to keep anticipating his moves. He knew the other man was good, but if he wanted to win, he needed to find a way to strike that Jin wouldn't be able to predict. Meanwhile, Jin got up, absent-mindedly waving his sword to send two huge chunks of ice flying Momo's way, forcing her to dodge and thus interrupt what looked like a long chant aimed to summoning some large light construct. Toshiro frowned, and charged in. He had to keep Jin focused on himself, so that Momo could manage whatever she was planning. And he had to stop him, for having tried to kill her. It was that, more than anything, that gave him the ability to channel his willingness to kill into his blade, the sense of dread coming from it immediately drawing Jin's attention to the attack. Jin went into a block by simply flicking his sword and growing it to the right length, but Toshiro had expected that by now, so he simply unleashed a flood of ice from his blade, using the sheer onslaught to mask the fact he'd also grown a block of ice around the point of contact of the blades, to lock Jin in place. As he'd expected, Jin was somehow able to push the ice away from himself, but not his blade. He'd hoped this would let his Zanpakuto cut through Jin's own, but before that could happen, or he could even check whether it was, Jin's sword simply disappeared from the lock, shortened to the point the lock no longer affected it at all. Toshiro dove to the ground, to dodge the lengthening of the blade to strike past his block that he knew was coming, and shot out another blast of ice like a wave as he did. It struck at Jin's leg, the man stumbling, and Toshiro went for a raising stab as he got up, while also letting ice erupt from his sword in the form of multiple dragon heads. Despite the lack of balance, Jin managed to cut through them all and send them flying, the blade sharpened by the imposed sharpness on it, but Toshiro countered with his own, stopping Jin's sword and once again locking it to his will strong enough to nick Jin's blade for a moment, before the former captain managed to harden it and stop Toshiro's, creating another stalemate. Jin's smirk widened a bit, and he commented, "Well, it seems like you managed to reach mastery of Zanjutsu after all. Overpowering my will with yours is no easy feat." Perhaps he wanted to say something more, some mocking insult or such, but that was when Momo completed her incantation, the sudden surge of Ryotsu coming from her direction clear. Toshiro went to disengage, but he found that his sword was stuck to Jin's, the other man shaking his head in amusement before turning to shout at Momo, almost laughing. "You'll need to kill your friend as well, Hinamori." Toshiro grimaced, as he could feel the Ryotsu of whatever she'd created wavering, and shouted back, "Don't worry Momo, just attack him. Trust me to make it." The Ryotsu rose again and started barreling toward them, and Toshiro let the ice erupt from his blade in every direction, like an explosion, and the strength of it was enough to send him flying backward. This gave Toshiro the time to see that Momo had used a Kido he didn't know, which looked like 3 giant nails, darting toward Jin far faster than Shunpo could manage. Toshiro himself was only barely going to outrun them, and he'd had to blast himself away from them. Jin, however, made it out just like he had avoided most anything else, by aiming his sword downward and causing it to instantly grow to several meters of length, the growth of the blade pushing him away from the point of impact just in time before the nails hit and exploded. The blast sent Toshiro flying even further away, and he could see the same had been true for Jin, leaving them both unarmed and able to use Ho-Ho to slow down their fall. Jin, he saw, was already aiming his blade at Momo, and for a moment he thought of using a blast of ice to deflect the thrust. It would take proper timing, but he was confident he could do it. However, Momo's words came back to him, and he gritted his teeth instead, closing his eyes and using the time her attack and distraction had brought him to raise his blade above his head and call out for the power of his sword, willing it to fuse with his own. Soar above the frozen sky, higher in Meru. The power of his Bankai rippled from him across the area, Toshiro taking a moment to breathe in the suddenly almost freezing air, letting the shock of it fill his body with energy as he opened his eyes, white mist raising as he let a long breath out. He was aware of the 3 giant flowers of ice, with 4 diamond-shaped petals each, forming as if from nothing in the air behind him. In truth, fragments of ice that had been left scattered across the courtyard throughout the fight and were barely visible had been collected to form them, but Toshiro paid it no notice, merely keeping the constructs at the edge of his awareness. Jin had managed to wound Momo, he saw, but it had been a minor wound on the side of her leg, and Toshiro calling out his Bankai had stopped him from pressing her offensive on her, so she was limping backwards and trying to apply some sort of healing Kido while Jin refocused completely on Toshiro, his grin growing menacing. "Well, it seems like you're ready to go all out, Toshiro. No more mercy for your poor misguided captain." Toshiro felt the spark of rage raising at those words, but now that Higher-in Meru's power was flooding his system, their soul united as one, it was easily snuffed, and he delivered his answer in a cold tone instead. "You lost any right to mercy when you betrayed us all. You're not worthy of calling yourself captain anymore." Jin cocked his head to the side. "Aren't I? I still have the power of one. You think your Bankai is enough to overcome that?" Toshiro didn't bother answering that. Instead, he let the ice erupt from his sword once again, letting part of it flow over his body, wrapping itself around him in the shape of an armor, while the rest erupted from the tip of his sword, forming into a blade of ice that continued to grow towards Jin at the same time, in a manner reminiscing what Jin himself could do. The man merely dodged to the side to avoid it, but a spike of ice exploded from it toward Jin, a process that repeated itself with more and more spikes every time Jin dodged in a different direction, the ice chasing him. The man's smile grew with every turn, until he finally decided to actually slash at the ice, blasting all of the various shards away, only for the sharp and shattered spikes to stop, reorient themselves toward Jin, and blast toward him at high speed. Jin slashed them away again, but Toshiro grinned grimly as the shards reoriented themselves to attack him once again, to which Jin answered with Kido, raising a huge wall of glowing light that looked like a slab of jelly, catching a number of ice shards within, at which point the others started to move around it. Jin raised a second wall to catch the last group of ice shards, then turned to Toshiro and asked, sounding amused. Is that the power of your Bankai? To control the ice you created but isn't in contact with your sword anymore? Toshiro didn't answer, even as he felt the third ice petal behind himself fall to the ground. Instead, he focused on the large ice wings that had formed at the back of his armor, each far larger than he himself was, and willed them to beat, lifting him into the air. Jin jumped, clearly aiming to remove himself from the corner in which he'd put himself, only to have his path cut by a barrage of light darts Momo had sent at him. He managed to deflect those, but it left Toshiro free to strike at him, the ice covering his body smashing straight into him. That one, Jin withstood with Hakuda, so that he was smashed back into the prison's wall rather than impaled by the ice, but Toshiro didn't let up as a large chunk of the very same ice separated from his huge blade and formed into a vice around Jin's chest, encasing him as well as trapping him there. The man's smile dimmed a bit as the ice grew over him and Toshiro rose higher into the air, and he idly commented, looking at him. It is, I admit, quite impressive. Is this how you plan for me to die, then? Frozen to death? Toshiro wasn't sure that he wanted to answer, but Momo was apparently angry enough to shout back, her fist clenched at her side. The only things that matters is that we will take you down. Together. Jin sounded, if anything, more amused, although his smirk grew even more threatening. Will you? Let's see then. The ice hadn't stopped growing as Jin spoke, but it hadn't yet reached the halfway points of his limbs. Deciding he had to accelerate the process, Toshiro aimed his blade at him to add more ice, but Jin continued to speak, in a declarative tone. Shoot to kill, Shinso. Then, even as Toshiro's ice slammed into him, immediately speeding up the ice growth to envelop him entirely, Jin just managed to turn his sword and, to Toshiro's shock, made it grow straight through and inside himself. Momo also seemed speechless, while Jin himself, Toshiro realized with a sudden start, was neither bleeding, nor had stopped smiling. With a twitch of his wrist just before it was fully encased in ice, the man's sword cut straight through him, the wall behind him, and the ice around him. The latter was partly blasted away and partly melted as the blade went through, while Jin himself fell into the rubble he'd created around himself just enough to get free from the ice, to then use it as a platform to jump safely away, with Ho-Ho allowing him to land gracefully on the ground. He turned, looking up at Toshiro, revealing himself completely unharmed, despite having just swung a sword through his own chest. Which, of course, made perfect sense. It wasn't like Toshiro didn't know that Jin's Bankai let him cut through anything, as well as choosing whether the things he cut through were damaged or not. He had just never expected the man to use the power on himself. It seemed that, once again, Toshiro had been played, and left unable to anticipate his opponent's move. He still, however, had a big card left to play, so he shouted to Momo, forcing into his tone a worry he wasn't feeling. Momo, I'm going to need to use much more power now. Keep an eye on the flower, let me know how many petals are left whenever one falls down. Of course, he could sense the 9 petals that were still there, but it was important that Jin believe otherwise. Thus, he didn't even glance at them, while instead making sure he had all of his attention focused on Jin, even as he willed his wings to bring him higher. Jin didn't seem inclined to let him gain altitude the way he wanted to, lazily swinging in his direction while the sword grew long enough to reach far enough he'd not be able to simply dodge backwards. Toshiro had a massive dragon of ice grow out of his sword to slam into the blade to see if it worked to redirect it, but the weapon went through the ice as if it wasn't there, leaving it completely undamaged. It didn't slow the swing down. Toshiro was forced to dodge down by it, and decided to just let his big attack out, simply letting a titanic iceberg, almost big enough to fill half the courtyard by itself, grow out of the blade and fall to the ground. The creation was instantaneous, and Momo called aid. As soon as the structure was formed, and Toshiro could feel the petal falling at the same time. As he'd hoped, Jin had to use his sword to dodge fast enough to avoid the falling glacier. He also moved to the opposite side of the courtyard from Momo, with the block of ice between them. Toshiro took advantage to reach higher, and then flew forward faster before leaving out another iceberg, so that Jin was forced to jump into the air, using his sword as more of a pole to vault over it. 7. Jin swung at him again, and Toshiro stopped his flight forward, slamming the palm of his free hand into his sword as he fired another iceberg, only this one flew forward horizontally toward Jin. 6. Toshiro was hoping that having to cut through the block of ice, or else having it slam straight into himself, would slow Jin's swing. What happened instead was that, when the blade and the ice met, the latter somehow exploded, scattering all over to the side as well as causing a hail of person-sized chunks of ice, and continued through without slowdown. Mere flying wouldn't be fast enough to avoid that, but Toshiro was already using Ho-Ho to make himself light enough for the ice wings to support him, so he took a page from Jin's own book, letting out a powerful blast of ice to send himself barreling sideways and away from the falling blade. Then, as Jin started falling and before he could strike, Toshiro summoned 2 more icebergs in quick succession, and sent them both flying toward Jin, striking from his sides to box him in, even as Momo shouted for. In the background. With no leverage, there should have been no way for Jin to avoid the attack. However, the man aimed his blade at one of the icebergs and make it grew toward it, but instead of piercing through, once the tip of the sword was embedded into the ice, it stopped growing into it, and instead started pushing Jin back and away from the frozen surface. Toshiro was left confused by this, as this would only result in Jin smashing into the other iceberg even faster, but when the man slammed into it, the whole thing exploded around him, as his body burrowed into and through the entire thing, scattering pieces of it all over and away from him. Toshiro had no idea how the man had managed to accomplish this, but he shook his head, refocusing, only for Jin's sword to suddenly strike 4 times, growing and retracting back each time, and shattering the last remaining ice flower all at once. Jin's tone as he spoke was mocking. 0. And what happens now? Toshiro fell, his wings locked. They still allowed him to float down, given their size and the fact he was still making sure his Ho-Ho hadn't failed him, but he was clearly not flying anymore. And as soon as he hit the ground, Jin struck again. Toshiro just barely managed to throw himself to the side, but even with that the hit nicked him straight through the ice armor, leaving him bleeding, and he stumbled onto one knee. While it was nearly impossible to tell what Jin's eyes were focused on, with the way they were squeezed, Toshiro got the sense they were moving from his kneeling form to the shattered remnants of his ice flowers, as the former captain made his way toward him at a slow pace, advancing among the titanic masses of ice that were surrounding them and littered the battlefield. His smile had grown somewhat smaller as he cocked his head to the side, and asked, sounding curious. So, this is it then? Your Bankai lets you control ice disconnected from your sword, but only within a time limit. Toshiro shrugged and answered, making sure to keep his emotions still. I only just awakened my Bankai, I'm working on removing the time limit. Jin's smirk grew at that, and he seemed poised to say something more, but he suddenly turned in Momo's direction, swiping his sword in her direction to disperse her summoned darts and forcing her into a dodge. Toshiro grimaced, but with the huge block of ice between them, he was hopeful that Jin wouldn't be able to fully focus on her. For his part, Jin seemed content enough to dismiss her for a moment, as he gazed down to Toshiro again and told him, with an amused, lecturing tone. So, you need to train your Bankai to use its ability for longer? Is that what you want me to believe, Toshiro? Because I don't, I think that's a lie. Toshiro didn't hesitate a moment, letting a dragon of ice erupt from his chest armor. Jin dodged backwards, only for the giant iceberg around him to suddenly change its shape into a huge, winged dragon. Jin rolled to dodge the creature's claw, and as he looked around, Toshiro grinned as all of the ice he'd scattered across the battlefield collected into huge dragons, collecting even the broken shards spread all over the place as an army of over 24 titanic creatures of ice surrounded them. Jin swung at Toshiro, forcing him to dodge with a roll, and then to focus exclusively on defense. Toshiro was suddenly being pressed hard, not a moment to think about his next move as Jin got close more than once, leaving him with tiny nicks all over and no chance to attack, at least, until a dozen of ice beams slammed into Jin from all sides, causing him to collapse to the ground. Toshiro couldn't help but let out a satisfied smile of his own, even as he let his ice sword grow long to strike at Jin from a distance again, while commenting. "Seems like your strategy of keeping me too occupied to target you didn't work, Jin." The silver-haired man sliced himself free from the ice surrounding him once more, but having to defend from the multiple dragons attacking him kept him from striking at Toshiro. They did not kept him from commenting, amused. "So, the real power is that the ice is alive, and can strike without your guidance, I see. Hiding a lie within a lie, clever tactic." Toshiro didn't let the compliment affect him, instead trying to hit Jin once more. The man avoided that particular strike, but with the number of attacks that were targeting him, it was only a matter of time before he would make a mistake. Hoping to push him into doing just that, Toshiro teased. "I'm just doing what I was taught by my captain, concealing the real extent of my strength, to surprise the enemy with the full range of my abilities at the most opportune time. Does it makes you feel stupid, to have your teachings turned against you?" The answer he received, however, was not what he expected, as Jin said, even as he dodged another group of 4 ice blasts. "Truthfully, it makes me proud." Then, before Toshiro had time to process the meaning of that, Jin's grew to strike one of the attacking dragon, causing it to explode into mist, as if it had somehow been instantly overheated from the inside. Toshiro immediately grew his armor to encase him fully, including an helmet, to keep himself from being steam-cooked by it, but even with that he couldn't see anything, and in particular couldn't see Jin. He could still feel him, however, a captain's soul being powerful enough to perceive with his senses, and while he and the ice dragons didn't share senses, he could only personally control the ice he could see. The rest would direct itself autonomously, with smarts comparable to a smart animal. They were made of pure Ryotsu and had all the same senses as Zanpakuto would have. Thus, he expected Jin's little trick to have no effect. Instead, what he felt was the ice dragons, whose presence he could sense even if he couldn't direct them, disappearing one by one, as if Jin was somehow getting rid of all the ice Toshiro had took so long to create. The answer, of course, was to create more ice. In truth, that usually was the best way to win a fight regardless of circumstances, and exceptions were rare. Toshiro immediately took to the air to do just that, even as the last of his ice dragons disappeared from his awareness. A moment later, a brutal wind dispersed the mist, leaving Jin standing in the middle of the courtyard with a self-satisfied smirk, his words barely loud enough to reach Toshiro, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "Going to try again, Toshiro? But you forget something. If you fly up there, who's going to keep Hinamori alive?" And as he spoke, Jin had already aimed his Zanpakuto at Momo, who looked like she had been burned by the overheated mist and was on her knees, healing herself and unaware of the risk. Once again, Toshiro was moving before he could think, diving to interpose himself as he got ready to slam down with an ice blast from his sword, but then, Jin's wrist changed by the barest angle before the blade grew in an instant. Rather than Momo, the Zanpakuto struck Toshiro straight through, the blade entering from his upper tights and going out the side of his abdomen, retreating immediately afterwards. It felt like a line of fire crossing through his body, and the pain of it had him lose control of his limbs and powers. He only barely held his Bankai active. Even as Toshiro crashed into the ground, he heard Momo screaming his name, but coming from a different direction than she was. He blinked, and realized the wounded Momo he'd seen had been some sort of illusion, attached to a device like the 12th Division was known to occasionally use. He admired for a moment the brilliance of the idea, creating a fake target while she moved nearer to their enemy invisibly, to strike by surprise. It was something Jin might not have expected from them, certainly not from straightforward, honest Momo. Then he felt the guilt overriding him as Momo fell a moment later, Jin's sword flashing twice at the place the shout had come from. That was his fault, Toshiro knew. If only he hadn't let himself be goaded by Jin's words, they just might have won. Any hope Momo might have been aiming for some sort of double bluff was dashed when Jin knelt to check her fallen body, before turning and heading toward Toshiro with a slow, self-satisfied pace. "I wasn't lying, you know. You are remarkably like me, and that is a good thing." A young prodigy, from the Rokanga, going through the academy at record speed, reaching the rank of lieutenant on merit alone, unlocking Bankai while still young. These are achievements to be proud of, and I contributed to enough of them to feel it. Jin knelt next to Toshiro's head, and he called on his Zanpakuto to heal his wounds. The sword answered, and he tried to leverage the healing into an attack, only to find that, despite the blade lending him the Ryatsu needed to recover to some degree, it didn't work. In fact, the pain spiked through his body as he tried, almost as if he'd tried to push his flesh into jagged blades, and the combination of the pain and the shock caused him to lose focus, and for his Zanpakuto to fall back into its sealed state. His enemy didn't seem to notice, or at least to care, as he grabbed him by the ear, and went on, still smirking. "And you know why you lost? Because you weren't like me enough." Jin forced Toshiro's head up, so that he had a better view of Momo, to make his point. "You let your love lead you into making the crucial mistake, you clung too strongly. A man who truly wants to win needs to learn that sometimes, to save those he loves, he needs to let them go." That wasn't true. Toshiro knew why Jin was putting things that way, but he knew also that he was wrong. Momo had told him they could win if they fought together, asked him to trust her, and he hadn't, neither letting her know his plan, nor trusting her to be able to save herself. He could see that, if only he had, things might have gone differently. He didn't have the breath to explain all that to Jin, nor the will, truly, but he did wanted the man to know how much Toshiro despised him in this moment, so he managed to get out, between coughs. "You're wrong." Jin's smirk disappeared at that, his expression going neutral, and then the man slammed Toshiro's head into the ground, before letting go. Toshiro could barely see the tall figure as it straightened and dusted off his hands. The smirk had reappeared, but there was something brittle to it now, something Toshiro had never seen there before. "Well, I guess that's it then, you had your chance, and wasted it. Thus, this is good." Then, Jin's head snapped to the side, just as a thin red laser hit him. Toshiro saw Jin's eyes going wide open with surprise for a moment, pupil so very thin inside washed out green irises that made him look almost inhuman, and then Jin fell to his knees, bleeding from what looked like dozens of different wounds, scraps all over the place, even what looked like a hole going all the way through his left hand. Jin coughed blood for a moment, before his eyes returned to being slit as they normally were, and then Toshiro could sense him drawing Ryatsu from his Zanpakuto to heal, except, Toshiro realized, he was drawing so much of it at once, it should be impossible for the sword to contain that much. It was almost as if he'd been storing Ryatsu within for years. Well over half of the wounds Jin had received disappeared at once, the rest starting to recover at a more normal speed, and the enemy turned in the direction the beam had come from, as if looking for what had caused the attack. And that was when the wall exploded. Toshiro could barely feel the terrifying pressure of Kenpaku's Ryatsu erupting in the courtyard, slamming into him with the power of an hammer, and had just the time to see the avalanche of rocks burying Jin under them, before finally losing consciousness. Chapter 53, Shikai. Ichigo threw Renji and Kisuke their swords, while securing the other two at his belt, before drawing his own, the handle feeling familiar in his hand as the connection with it reawakened fully. Even with the situation being as it was, he couldn't stop himself from grinning at the feeling of power being returned to his hands, happy to have the old man along for the fight once again. "I am also glad to have the ability to support you as well, Ichigo." Ichigo wanted to answer, but then the man in front of them took 2 steps forward, leaving the small armory he'd been waiting in, the bells tied to his hairs clinging as he did. Ichigo stepped back almost by instinct, before shaking his head and taking a guard position of his own. Kenpaku, meanwhile, continued to look at them, before demanding, "So? Is one of you going to start things off, or do I need to do it?" That seemed to be enough for Izuru to dart forward, going for a thrust straight at the head. He even used Ho-Ho to increase the speed and reach of his lunge. Ichigo wasn't sure if he could have dodged that, but the huge man did, almost contemptuously, crouching with a speed that didn't fit on somebody of his size, before striking at Izuru's abdomen with a brutal elbow blow. Izuru was smashed into the nearby wall, leaving it cracked. What Ichigo was surprised by, however, was that Izuru's abdomen was bleeding, and not from a bruise. It looked like he'd been stabbed, his hand trying to hold in a clear gut wound. Hanatero's eyes widened as he tried to circle around the group to reach Izuru and heal him. Meanwhile, Renji and Urahara both called upon their Shikai, but Kenpei didn't seem to pay them attention, instead turning toward Hanataro, clearly considering the possibility to charge at him. Ichigo moved without thinking, swinging his Zanpakuto at Kenpei. He was out of striking range, everybody was, but Ichigo simply let his Ryutsu fill the blade to grow it to a huge size, which surprised the enemy enough to make him stop and turn as he swung to intercept Ichigo's attack. Ichigo could feel the sense of doom coming from Kenpei's blade as it was swung, and indeed, he couldn't stop it despite his sword being in the path of Kenpei's, the top getting lopped off and flying in Hanataro's direction. However, thanks to Ichigo's intervention, young Shinigami managed to dodge that one easily, while the big one turned to focus his attention on Ichigo himself with a huge, bloodthirsty grin. "Nice trick you have there, let's see if it's going to be enough for you to stop me." The man went for a straight thrust at Ichigo, moving fast enough he couldn't dodge. He had just enough time to put his blade in the way, its size making it large enough to act as a shield. He filled the Zanpakuto with all the Ryutsu he could while forcing the shape to stand still, so that it would be denser and harder to cut through. He also wrapped an Hakuta shroud around it, with the side that was facing his opponent charged by repulsion that would hopefully slow down and deflect the blow, while the side facing him he filled with disdain, so that the sword had a second layer to harden it. Kenpei muscled straight through the repulsion as if it wasn't even there, and the sense of doom around his blade rose as it punched through the equivalent of two thick metal sheets with no apparent effort at all, the tip stabbing Ichigo in his chest. He looked in disbelief at the sword, which he absent-mindedly noticed was cracked and badly ruined, before Kenpei pulled it out, causing him to collapse on his knees, blood coming off both the wound itself, and from his mouth as if went inside his lungs and he had to cough some out. The enemy snorted, visibly annoyed as he commented. "Well, that was pathetic. If you have no killing intent at all, how can you hope to stand against me?" He then raised his sword as if to execute Ichigo, but before he could, Renji's whipping sword forced him to turn, almost lazily swinging in a parry that didn't simply deflect the blade away and to the side, but also cut straight through it. The ease with which Kenpei's ruined sword moved as if Renji's had almost no substance was astounding, but of course, Renji's Shikai wasn't slowed down by that, the blade regrowing as part of the return swing. It wrapped around Kenpei's left arm while the severed portion on the ground wrapped around his right leg, as he was only holding his sword in his right. The Shinigami captain severed the opponent's sword with ease once again, before glancing at what now looked like oversized bracelets wrapped around his limbs with disdain. Renji's sword reformed in a single movement of it was enough to anchor both of the severed blades to the floor and nearest wall, clearly planning to immobilize Kenpei. The moment they had, Chad fired one of his beam, but before the attack could hit, the large captain launched himself forward in a single jump. The movement ripped a chunk of pavement and wall which the man dragged behind himself without apparent effort as he landed right in front of Renji, ignoring the explosion behind him as Chad's beam impacted the place where he'd been standing just a moment before. Renji backpedaled immediately, raising his sword in guard at the same time in a desperate attempt to block that, predictably, did nothing to stop Kenpei's Zanpakuto as it went through Renji's and slashed deep wound in his chest while also sending him smashing into the wall behind him from the strength of the blow. Ichigo grimaced at the sight, even knowing Renji's own regeneration would see him recovering soon enough. Taking more attacks like those might just see him dead before he could. Luckily for Renji, Kenpei was stopped from attacking further for a moment by having to dodge another of Chad's beams. The captain turned in a sound of ringing bells with a manic grin on his face, but before he could charge, a set of purple ropes wrapped around his chest. He seemed to move down to glance at them in slow motion, and even when he spoke, the words came out of his mouth slurred and unnaturally slow, echoing weirdly. "Well, isn't this funny?" It was clear his movement were slowed down too, and Chad took advantage by firing two beams more, while Urahara appeared from the other side. However, putting his sword in the path of Urahara's only took a flick of his wrist, so even slowed down as he was, Kenpei managed to do it, stopping the attack and forcing Urahara back. The beams, on the other hand, Kenpei had no way of stopping, and they both pummeled straight into him, sending him crashing through a wall, raising a cloud of dust as the bricks broke and collapsed, as if his body was harder than the surrounding structure. Something that, absurdly, seemed to be true as, when the dust settled, the man was still standing. His clothes looked slightly singed and the barest hint of a bruise was left on his chest, the hit having apparently barely managed to hurt him, and not even knocked him down. The sight caused Chad to take a step back in shocked surprise, while Ichigo muttered to himself. Impossible. He'd seen the power of Chad's beams so many times now, and just a single hit was normally enough to take down multiple hollows, and the only thing he'd seen take multiple without being defeated was the Minos Grande, and even that monster had been annoyed by it. Kenpeki, however, was smiling, his eye glinting with anticipation, as if enjoying how little a double hit had hurt him. That was when a bit more blood filled his throat as punishment for having tried to speak, and he had to cough it back, using his sword as a support to avoid falling down into the ground. A moment later, however, he felt a hand supporting his side, and when he turned, Hanataro nodded to him, placing the flat of his blade against his leg as he whispered. "I'll take your wounds, I just need a few seconds." Meanwhile, Urahara had jumped at Kenpeki, trying to take advantage of any lingering weakness from just being hit, but the man suddenly flexed the muscles of his chest and the ropes of purple energy around him shattered, flying toward Urahara and forcing him backwards, with Kenpeki immediately charging after him. Renji struck before he could reach, his Zanpakuto extending in a sudden strike. Kenpeki blocked easily enough, but the strength of the impact still pushed him away, and Ichigo, capitalizing on this, swung his blade from the other side, making it grow so big as he did that it cut straight into the corridor's wall and sent a hail of debris flying in front of the sword's cutting edge. With his sword hand occupied by Renji's sword, Ichigo was sure Kenpeki couldn't do anything to protect his side, so he was left stumped when the man's fist snapped to catch one of the coming debris, using it to bat away the others and then block Ichigo's blade, the piece of broken brick somehow managing the impossible feat of holding still the Zanpakuto's blade before Kenpeki pushed the sword away with sheer muscular strength alone. Izuru struck then, aiming for Kenpeki's leg with a descending swing. The huge man managed to move his leg away as he turned, his swing pushing Renji's blade away and continuing toward Izuru's face. The blonde managed to stop in time, his sword just managing to smack Kenpeki's away. The impact damaged Izuru's blade and sent him rolling backwards, but Ichigo could see the smirk on his lips, as a moment later Kenpeki's sword dragged his arm to the ground, leaving the huge man with an expression of clear surprise on his face. Renji clearly had expected that to happen, as he charged toward Kenpeki while extending his blade behind himself as he ran, clearly wanting to take advantage of a long wind-up for a more powerful and fastest swing. Kenpeki's surprise morphed into an appreciative grin, and then he attempted to parry. The movement was visibly slower than his previous swings had been, but nowhere near as slow as his movement had been when Urahara had wrapped his energy ropes on him. And, most importantly, it was somehow still faster than Renji's attack. The slow descending swing intercepted the whip sword just in time, cutting straight through it and sending the pieces scattering all over the area, and continued upwards to bite into Renji's chest. Ichigo saw the rigidity of Hakuta helping hold his body together so that he wasn't bisected, but the power of the attack still sent him flying upwards and smashing into and through the ceiling, before collapsing to the ground and being buried by a rain of broken brickwork his impact had caused. Kenpeki then lunged toward Izuru, who was astounded by, and unprepared for, the speed Kenpeki could move at despite his sword's weight having been modified, and while he tried to strike back, the captain's sword broke his and pierced through to his hand, causing the blonde Shinigami to scream while Kenpeki laughed. That was clever, but a little extra weight is no match for the strength of a true warrior. And, as if to prove his words, he somehow lifted Izuru by his impaled hand alone, before turning with a sudden push, the sword sliding out of the wound as Izuru was sent flying straight into a beam Chad had tried to fire at Kenpeki's back. Izuru fell to the ground with ugly burns, and taking advantage of the moment of shock, Kenpeki ripped the remains of Renji's sword from his leg and arm and threw them at Ichigo's friend. Chad raised the gauntlet on his arm, with its large, shield-like protrusions, just in time to protect himself, but even so he was pushed backwards by the power of the impact, and left staggering. That was when Urahara dashed toward Kenpeki, his form glowing as his sword moved like a purple blur, the attack so fast Ichigo had trouble following it, even as the Shinigami captain on the receiving end managed to dodge out of the way of it, grinning all the while. It took Ichigo a moment to realize that Urahara had wrapped himself in bands and scarves of the purple energy his Shikai created, with some wrapped around his arms, legs and torso. Ichigo was left confused as to how the power was making him faster, but Kenpeki didn't seem to care, as after his initial dodge, he went to the counter-attack. Urahara avoided the first swing by a hair, but then he dodged the following one faster, and his movements grew more secure and his reaction quicker as Kenpeiki's unrelenting assault continued, and Ichigo realized Urahara hadn't made himself faster, rather he'd slowed his own perceptions, in the same type of effect as he'd used to help Ichigo train, and thanks to that, he appeared to be moving faster, when in truth he was just processing things so rapidly and reacting so promptly that he was outpacing his own body's normal speed. As Ichigo charged in to help, Urahara managed to dodge Kenpeiki's attack by enough of a margin to launch a counter-attack of his own, but Kenpeiki slapped it away with the back of his free left hand, Urahara's Zanpakuto breaking from the impact. Ichigo was left astounded by that, and even more so when, as the tip of his blade slammed straight in the middle of Kenpeiki's back a moment later, it felt as if he'd hit a steel wall, his hands bleeding from the backlash as his sword failed to pierce his target at all. Having overextended to try and stab Kenpeiki, Urahara was left open to the Shinigami captain's kick, and as he was sent flying, Ichigo saw that the point where he'd been kicked was bleeding as if he'd been stabbed, much like, he realized, Izuru had from Kenpeiki's elbow strike at the beginning of the battle. The man turned, and rather than let him cut through his Zanpakuto again, Ichigo had it release all of its Ryutsu there with a repulsive charge, which, rather than pushing Kenpeiki away, propelled Ichigo back. It still accomplished the result of getting him out of the reach of the enemy's swing. The tall Shinigami loomed in front of Ichigo, as he commented, sounding bored. "Cool trick, but I told you before, if you don't strike with the intent to kill, no amount of tricks is going to help you." He seemed about to say something more, when Chad fired one of his beams from his position behind Ichigo. Kenpeiki raised his hand and grimaced as the beam slammed into it, taking a few steps backwards, but otherwise remaining mostly unarmed, the palm of his left hand somewhat bruised but no more harmed than that. Ichigo just stared. "How?" Kenpeiki growled and answered. "Even if I explained it, you wouldn't understand, no matter how many times I do, no one ever does. Besides, you can't even properly make your blade cut something in the first place, it'd be pointless." Kenpeiki raised his sword again, and the sense of dread coming from it was clear to Ichigo, and now that he was paying attention, he realized that, to some extent, the feeling was coming from the man's entire body, not just his sword. "I know what he's doing, he's focusing on one of his sword's properties, and enhancing it with his will." Ichigo's eyes widened at that, as he recognized the technique as the same one Hiriko had used to completely overpower him in their duel. He narrowed his eyes as he remembered how he'd gotten through it last time, by using his tricks to attack from different directions, and not having to confront Hiriko's sword at all. What I'm not sure about is how he's extending it to his entire body. He can't make his arms cut through things, they're not an item for him to enhance the properties of, and cutting isn't a property of arms anyway. That was, indeed, the problem, and while Ichigo understood what he was facing, that helped little when he had no idea how to use the ability at all, much less the experience to do it at the level of his opponent. "I know how it is done." Ichigo was left stumped for a moment, and his sword explained. "My previous holder mastered the ability, so I know what it feels like when it's used properly. If you can reach the right emotion, I can do the rest myself." While it had felt as if the conversation had gone on for a long time in his head, in truth the exchange had happened at the speed of thought, so it had been barely a moment, during which Kenpeiki had been apparently trying to take a measure of him with a calculating gaze, or perhaps tried to divine if he had some other trick ready to use against him. Apparently having decided he didn't, the enemy moved, a single step putting Ichigo within his reach, and the huge man swung his sword almost lazily, yet the sense of dread that told Ichigo the attack was unmistakably the same as before, and would cut through any block Ichigo could put up. "Just focus, if you believe that I am strong enough to block him, I will be. Fear will make me weak, but if you give me your trust, I'll be able to hold." Ichigo was, for a brief moment, unsure if that would suffice, but he focused, calling back the memory of what his fight with Hiriko Shinji had taught him, and let that certainty that swords were meant to cut and not be cut become the only focus of his mind, concentrating on that to the point his mind started to hurt as he tried to give form to the very concept of sharpness. He kept focusing until the very last moment before sending the emotion to his Zanpakuto, trusting the old man would know how to use it. He felt it as the emotion flowed from him to the blade, but it was different from when he simply pushed Ryutsu into the blade to make it larger or denser. The Ryutsu seemed to disappear, as if the sword was eating it somehow, and as it did, Ichigo felt the very certainty he'd created in his mind radiating from the blade itself, a concept given form. It was very similar to the sense of dread he was feeling from Kenpeiki's sword, but the emotion was almost the precise opposite, a sense of security and stability. The blades clashed with a deafening clangor, and as Ichigo opened his eyes, he saw that his blade stood intact, its edge holding that of Kenpeiki at bay, while huge Shinigami's only visible eye glinted with excitement. "That's the willingness to kill I was looking for." Then, the man suddenly pushed forward, and Ichigo found himself rolling backwards, the man's sheer strength sending him flying. His back erupted with pain as he smashed into the wall, his breath stolen by the impact, but he knew that, if he hadn't managed to match his opponent's cutting power with his own, a slash with that much strength behind it would have split him in two. "I've got your back, Ichigo, if we trust each other, we can do this, together." Ichigo smiled to himself, they really could. After all, now that he had a means of hurting their target, it was just a matter of landing a decisive hit, and between his own tricks and the others, he was certain he could manage at least that much. As if to prove his thoughts right, Chad shot another beam at their opponent, to stop the man from closing on Ichigo and finishing him off. The beam felt more powerful to Ichigo than any Chad had shot before, as if he was somehow pouring more power into it, and Kenpeiki apparently agreed, as he put his crossed arms in front of his face to stop the attack this time, and even so, was pushed back, smashing into a wall, even though it was visible the structure took more damage than the captain did. That was when the pile of stones and brickwork that was burying Renji suddenly exploded outwards, before being grabbed by a number of steel whips and being flung at Kenpeiki. It took Ichigo a moment to realize the redhead had surrounded himself with a number of his broken blades that were flexing and grabbing the broken pieces of the ceiling in tandem with the movement of the sword in his hand. It almost looked like Renji was surrounded by an octopus with metal tentacles for a moment, and while none of the attacks seemed to hurt their enemy any, it gave Hanataro time to reach Ichigo, helping him up and taking his wounds away, with a glance confirming that Izuru and Urahara had both been already healed and were taking advantage of Renji's constant cover fire to close in. However, the amount of fallen brickwork on the ground, which Renji had been using as ammunition, was not unlimited, and the very moment he ran out of projectiles, Kenpeiki jumped out of the hole in the wall he'd been pinned down into, lunging toward Renji. But even as the redhead jumped backwards, Urahara fired 3 long bars of purple lights straight in Kenpeiki's path, and even as they broke when he barreled through them, it slowed him enough for Renji to avoid the attack, while Izuru jumped with a descending strike at Kenpeiki's head. The man didn't bother to even use his arms to parry, instead merely twisting his head so that the long spikes his hairs were arranged into sheared through the Zanpakuto, sending the tip of the weirdly U-shaped weapon flying higher, striking the ceiling, while he went to thrust his sword into Izuru's belly. However, Izuru dodged backwards with a speed that Ichigo found impossible for a moment, before he realized Renji's sword was wrapped around Izuru's leg and dragging him away from Kenpeiki's blade, compensating for the lack of speed by letting the dodge at him. Izuru also grinned, and Ichigo understood why when, a moment later, the ceiling collapsed onto Kenpeiki like an avalanche, clearly having been made too heavy to stay up when the broken piece of Izuru's Shikai had hit it. Ichigo unsheathed his Auswall, and willed the item awake, the black Daito taking shape into his hand, and immediately starting to absorb Ryutsu from the air. With how much Kenpeiki had, the sword was charging itself faster than he had expected it to. He felt the surprise from his Zanpakuto as he prepared himself to strike, almost as if the sentient sword was studying the newest one. The weapon, it's not a Zanpakuto, but close. Ryutsu keeps it together, but it also draws more to itself from your surroundings. Did you grant it that power somehow? Ichigo explained that he'd merely used Fullbring to awaken the item, and the form of its power was something the item had come up with on its own, responding to Ichigo's wish of going from powerless to powerful. Ichigo felt thoughtful understanding coming from his Zanpakuto at that. I see. The sword gained a power that makes it gain power over time, focused on that process of growing from powerless to powerful, and since it was your desire, it fashioned its mechanics around the same concept your Quincy powers use. An ability suited to both who you are, and your wishes. The comment left Ichigo puzzled, but then the ceiling stopped falling on Kenpeiki, and Ichigo darted in without losing a moment, to take advantage of the fact that, even as the rain of stone had only lightly scuffled their enemy, it had also let him somewhat reeling. Ichigo thrust forward with Getsuga, and as he expected, Kenpeki swung his sword at it, cutting through. The sword started to reform on its own as soon as that happened, but more importantly, the attack left Kenpeki's left side open to a swing from Ichigo's Zanpakuto. The man managed to get his arm in the way, the blade biting into the flesh before Kenpeki somehow managed to hold it there by flexing his muscles to trap the weapon, as if his ability to make his body equivalent to a sword extended to within his body as well. The huge man grinned at having Ichigo trapped and went in for a headbutt that would certainly behead Ichigo, but that was when his Zanpakuto started to draw Ryotsu from Ichigo on its own. While he had no idea why, he trusted his sword and let the power flow freely, and as usual, the influx of Ryotsu enlarged and lengthened the blade. However, since the blade was drawing the Ryotsu in, rather than Ichigo pushing it, rather than grow away from him, the sword grew toward Ichigo, pushing him away from Kenpeki with that growth. As soon as he had the distance to be outside of his enemy's range, Ichigo stopped the flow of Ryotsu and then had his sword release all the stored Ryotsu at once, reducing his Zanpakuto back to its normal size. Kenpeki seemed surprised for a moment, then his grin grew huge as he commented. "Well, would you look at that? I guess I understand now why Jin said you were interesting." Before he could ask what the man meant, Kenpeki was jumping forward for him, only to be stopped by a new blast of Ryotsu from Chad. The Shinigami captain took that with his sword, a spiderweb of cracks spreading across the already badly damaged weapon as Kenpeki was pushed back, straight into Renji's extending blade which slammed him into another wall. Ichigo wondered why Kenpeki wasn't repairing his sword, but before he could think the matter over more, Izuru was at his side, asking with bated breath. "You can hurt him." Ichigo nodded, and explained. "Yeah, it's just a matter of focusing on making your sword really cut. It's like he's making his whole body into a sword, so you just need to make your sword capable of cutting through." Izuru frowned, clearly perplexed at the explanation. How can he be doing something like that? Ichigo tried to think of anything, and all that came to mind was Yoriyuki's similar ability to turn her whole body into a weapon thanks to her Shikai fusing her and the Zanpakuto together. It was the only thing that seemed like it made sense. Perhaps it's his Shikai? I've seen something like that before. If you say so. Alright, then I'll tell Renji, and then the rest of us can come up with a strategy where we distract him so you two can land blows that'll actually hurt. Ichigo was surprised by that. Renji can do it? He didn't use the ability against me. Izuru shrugged. Maybe he didn't want to kill you? Also, from what I understand, he's not very good at it. He can only sustain the effect on his sword for a fraction of a moment. Ichigo wasn't sure how that could be possible, at least until his Zanpakuto told him, in an amused tone. Because it's very uncomfortable for the sword to be under the effect, I'm used to it, but if he just learned the ability recently, it's natural that he has trouble with extending the duration. All that Ichigo could do in answer to that was to send some gratitude to his Zanpakuto spirit for being that dependable, even as both himself and Izuru ducked to let Chad fire some of his beams above their head to help Renji keep Kenpeki pinned while Urahara seemed to be charging up a spiral of purple whips around his blade. So, how are we gonna do this? I think we should retreat toward the cell block. The corridors here are keeping us from boxing him in properly, while once we're there, we'd have more room to maneuver and attack together. Ichigo nodded, then refocused on their enemy in front of them just in time to see Kenpeki dodge one of Chad's beams by leaning forward with a sudden movement. The man then took advantage of that brief respite from Chad's attack to close his fists around Renji's extended sword, shattering the blade in his grip before throwing the broken piece of metal at Chad. Renji was quick to stop the projectile with his Shikai's power, but that left Kenpeki free to charge at him. Or it would have, if Urahara hadn't swung his sword to send what looked like a huge net of purple threads to trap their enemy. Kenpeki was fast enough to dodge to the side, but the movement gave Ichigo, Izuru, and Chad the room they needed to rejoin the other two, before gesturing for them to follow as they rushed further away from Kenpeki. Or, at least, that was the idea. Kenpeki, however, frowned at seeing them escape, and used a single swing of his sword to sever the door to the safe room from its hinges, before throwing it with all of his strength, the projectile slamming into the ceiling at an angle that caused a portion of it to collapse and them to stop. The stones were obstructing half the corridor, and while there was enough space to squeeze through, it wasn't going to be enough to get the group through. Cowards! I'm not going to let you deny me my fight. Urahara immediately swung his sword, directing the net he'd created with a lone tendril attached to his blade to form a barrier, while Renji scoffed and asked, as they all turned to face the advancing captain. "Why were we escaping anyway? Ichigo can cut him, it's just a matter of wanting your sword to cut, so you should be able to as well." Renji looked surprised for a moment, then asked with a suddenly thoughtful expression. "So, we were relocating to a better battlefield then? I thought the cell area would give us the room we needed, once we smashed the cell doors down." While they had been speaking, Kenpeki had reached the net and swung his sword to take it down. However, each rope he cut through slowed his swing down, so that after the first two, the attack stopped itself, forcing him to have to swing away at it again. While at the back of their group Hanataro was shaking in fear, Chad instead looked ready to shot the moment the net was down, so Ichigo knelt to not obstruct his line of fire as he asked Renji, in a dry tone. "Does it matter, at this point?" Renji grinned. "Of course it does, don't worry, I'm going to get us there far faster than running would." Then, the redhead raised his sword above his head and shouted, loud and clear. "Bankai, Rain, King Zabumaru." Roriatsu erupted from Renji's sword, filling the corridor with a wave strong enough that even Kenpeki, who had just finished cutting down the net, took a step back as he was invested by it. As the Roriatsu subsided, Renji looked remarkably different, his torso and neck wrapped into a red cowl that reached a bit above his chin, with a skeletal gauntlet emerging from his right shoulder and covering his entire arm, with a sixth finger emerging from the wrist and attaching itself to the pommel of the sword in his hands, which looked very similar to how it had in Shikai, except the handle was now also wrapped in bone. But the most notable change was that a skeletal snake was attached to the bottom of the fur coat, with a coil wrapped around Renji's waist like a belt, and the snake's head dangling a few centimeters above the ground. Kenpeki's grin grew manic as he saw Renji's new look and then commented, sounding quite eager. "Seems like you learned a lot since you left the 11th, Renji. Going to show me what your Bankai does? Just watch." And then, before Kenpeki could react, the skeletal snake skull hissed before suddenly digging underground, its body growing longer with more and more vertebrae forming. As it did, the ground started to shake, until a titanic snake erupted from the ground right in front of Kenpeki. The snake attempt to strike was stopped by the captain's blade, but at the moment of impact, the sword was unable to cut through the snake's skull, pushing Kenpeki one step back as the bone snake bounced back from it. Kenpeki grinned, and went to move forward, but the body of the snake suddenly out of another point of the ground, much larger and bigger than the rest had been before, smashing into him and pushing him backwards. Meanwhile, more skeletal coils emerged just behind the group, and these ones were huge, each vertebra the size of a person. Renji grinned as he pushed Hanataro toward the closest one, and the young medic was absorbed into the bones. As Renji gestured, Ichigo touched one and was absorbed inside himself. It felt like he was swimming weightless into a warm, welcoming darkness for a moment, before a force dragged him out, and as Ichigo stumbled through, he found himself into the cell area, surrounded by the others, with Renji appearing last. Ichigo noticed that his skeleton belt now ended in a single vertebra for a moment, before a new snake head formed from it, but the separated coils seemed to still be moving around them, the ground softly rumbling from the movement of the snake underneath. Izuru looked appreciative as he commented. "Your Bankai lets you move from one point of it to another." Renji shrugged, turning toward a corridor as he answered. "It also grants healing while you're inside it. I've not mastered all aspects of it yet, but in essence it just make my sword a part of my body, so where one piece is, I also can be." Hanataro looked scared for a moment, before he suggested, shaking. "Shouldn't we take this opportunity to run?" Izuru shook his head as he answered. "Can't you feel Momo and Toshiro fighting just outside? We can't leave without them. Besides, Kenpeki is gonna chase us, he's following the underground tremors, so we can't use Zabumaru to escape, and he'll be in that corridor there in 3 seconds at most." At Renji's declaration, everybody turned in the direction he was pointing. Izuru motioned for Hanataro to hide in the half-collapsed cell to the left, while Chad moved to the right, with Ichigo moving opposite Renji, and Urahara had started to swing his sword like a madman, sending purple bands of energy to stick all over the walls, floor, and ceiling of the hallway. A moment later, a running Kenpeki turned the corner, only to step on the first of the purple bands, which wrapped around his feet. That caused him to suddenly stop as his foot failed to move up from the ground, and as he glanced down at it, Chad fired a brutally powerful beam that slammed Kenpeki into the wall at his back, from which Renji's skeletal snake immediately erupted, wrapping itself twice around his sword arm. The snake's head then went for a sudden strike, but Kenpeki's other arm moved faster still, grasping the skull within his hand. The skull resisted for a moment, before being crushed in Kenpeki's fist, even as the man grinned in amusement to that. Then, even as the skull seemed to be slowly regenerating, Kenpeki used it as leverage to lift his feet from the ground, before smashing the one that didn't have a purple band around it into the wall. Ichigo took a moment to notice that the heel was more in depth inside the wall, Kenpeki using it like a talon to grip the wall thanks to his ability to cut through it. The man used the support point he'd just created for himself to suddenly push forward with all of his strength, the combination of it and his ability enough to shred through the skeletal snake's hold, barreling toward a surprised Urahara while avoiding all of the traps he'd laid. Ichigo dashed forward himself, placing his Zanpakuto up in a block as he rushed to interpose himself between Kenpeki and Urahara. The Zanpakuto clashed with each other, but the sheer momentum and weight of their opponent as he'd thrown himself at them was enough to send them both crashing and rolling to the ground. Even as he was hit, Ichigo could feel a sense of eagerness from the black sword in his other hand, and while he had no idea what the blade would do when used, he thrust forward with it at Kenpeki anyway, calling out, "Getsuga Tensho!" As he did, just to see if the power the sword had claimed good enough to pierce the heavens would be enough to pierce through Kenpeki's defense. As it turned out, it was not. However, what Ichigo hadn't expected was for the power to manifest into a black blast of Ryotsu, which smashed into Kenpeki with a screeching sound of steel on steel. The sheer piercing power of the blast was enough to reverse Kenpeki's movement and smash him into and through one of the cell's door. That was as much as Ichigo was able to feel before he and Urahara both smashed into the ground, getting pretty beat up as they rolled into a stop, although Hanataro was quickly to their side to heal them, removing Ichigo first. Meanwhile, Kenpeki was immediately hit by one of Chad's beam, just long enough for Izuru, who had cut down the metal bars of the cells closest to him, to send them flying at Kenpeki one after the other, each being light as a feather as he launched them but impacting with a weight matching something many times their size. Chad kept firing his beams to keep the pressure up, and a moment later Renji sent a barrage of section of his own sword flying as well. Due to being hidden in between the others' attacks, Renji's own were difficult for Kenpeki to notice, and while they only cut into him for a brief moment before losing all penetrating power, that was enough that a number of small scratches were starting to accumulate on the Shinigami captain. However, it was clear that the barrage wasn't going to be enough. When it had started, Kenpeki was laid out on the ground, but by now, despite the attacks interfering with his every movement, he was back to standing on his knees, and Ichigo knew that, unlike Chad's beams, Izuru's projectiles weren't infinite, and Renji would soon need to stop to create more of his own as well. Hoping to contribute to the attack, Ichigo focused for a moment on Getsuga Tensho, and swung it down. He'd expected the beam to be less powerful, since it didn't have as long to charge, but he'd not expected for the beam, instead of striking like a spear, to instead look more like a black crescent of Ryotsu with a visibly sharp edge. And while it only let out another shower of sparks as it impacted on Kenpeki's shoulder and was deflected by it, when it was redirected into the nearby walls, it let a very deep cut in them, causing a rain of debris to fall onto Kenpeki. This seemed to give the huge man an idea, however, as he suddenly spun on himself, the ragged edges of his Haori cutting into the ground around him to form a cloud of dust that obscured his form for a moment, forcing the attack to stop as they couldn't really aim without getting in the way of each other. And that moment was all the time Kenpeki needed to send all of the projectiles that were lying around him flying back, as if he'd used his coat to catch them all at once and then thrown them back in a single spinning motion. Izuru's smashed bars were sent flying all over the place, smashing the ceiling and walls pretty brutally as they bounced around them, and the shards of Renji's sword were just as easily confused into the barrage. Ichigo didn't get hurt thanks to having raised his Zanpakuto into a block, while the just-healed Urahara interposed himself to keep Hanataro from being hit, but everybody else was hurt brutally. Chad dodged the broken bars sent his way, but was then hit in the back by falling pieces of broken ceiling those bars had damaged, while Izuru had his leg visibly broken and Renji had been impaled in the side by one of his own sword fragments in the initial attack. Unlike everybody else, the redhead had managed not to be left into shock by the hit, probably due to his familiarity with getting hurt, and immediately removed the shrapnel to let his regeneration get to work, but even so, he was clearly in pain. Ichigo sent another Getsuga Tenshou into the dust cloud as he called out to Renji, in as urgent a tone as he could manage. "Everybody's hurt, you need to use your power to get them all together and out of the way." Renji glanced at him and nodded, and a multitude of gigantic snake skeleton erupted from the ground, a number simply emerging directly under Chad, Izuru, Hanataro, and Urahara to absorb them immediately and leave them back on the corner of the battlefield, near the one cell with the broken wall and ceiling. Kenpeki emerged from the cloud of dust with a clinging of bells and a frown on his face as he said, looking straight at Ichigo. "I do hope that wasn't the best shot you could give, it'd be might disappointing." The answer, however, didn't come from Ichigo, but rather Urahara, as the blonde said, sounding smug. "No, this will be." Everybody glanced Urahara's way, which allowed Ichigo to see that Hanataro had cured everybody, although Chad was still somewhat reeling while Izuru was looking out the broken wall with wide eyes, trembling in fear as he hissed something hurriedly to a very shaken and hesitant Hanataro, who was looking at his blade with doubt. However, Urahara's gesture with his sword was what caught Ichigo's attention the most, before he had a flash of understanding and turned just in time to see all of the bands of purple energy that the scientist had scattered in the corridor flying back and all wrapping themselves around Kenpeki at once, encasing his every limb within them. Ichigo could see Kenpeki's muscles bulging and the bands being ripped apart in slow motion, so he called out to Renji, even as he stabbed Getsuga Tensho into the ground. "Renji, we need to attack from both sides, and make it impossible to dodge." And as he spoke, Ichigo swung, making the Zanpakuto grow to an almost gigantic size, covering half of the entire corridor as it grew bigger than he'd ever made it before, to the point that, even as he made the weapon as repulsive as he could manage, he'd not have been able to continue swinging it without using Getsuga as leverage. Renji didn't disappoint either, having all of his titanic skeleton snakes strike from multiple angles and the opposite side of Ichigo's swing, even if he could only make it cut for the barest moment. At that size it should be enough to cut Kenpeki in two. While Kenpeki managed to sever all the bands he'd been wrapped into incredibly quickly, considering how slow he had been forced to do it, it was clear he could not dodge. However, instead of being afraid, he grinned maniacally, and then let his sword go, the weapon falling to the ground with a tremendous clangor and leaving a deep crater in it, as Ichigo remembered that the enemy had been fighting with an impossibly weighty weapon the entire battle this far. And without it, while not fast enough to dodge, he was fast enough to dart into Renji's attack, grabbing the titanic snake with both hands and ripping it out of the ground as he swung it around like a huge, room-sized flail, sending the rest smashing all over the place as the entire area, for all practical purposes, exploded. While the walls and ceilings surrounding them collapsing on all sides was enough to stop Ichigo's already difficult to control attack, the huge blade at least gave him something under which to hide, so that he wasn't simply crushed under the prison as it crumbled around him. Once the rain of brick and stone was over, Ichigo returned his Zanpakuto to its normal size as he got up, to find himself looking at an absurd picture, enough so it took him a moment to take everything in. He was standing in the ruins of a building in front of what looked like a large courtyard littered with what looked like gigantic chunks of ice glinting under the moonlight. He saw that a young woman in Shinigami clothes and with black hairs was being tended to by a very worried Hanataro, a wounded Izuru supporting an unconscious, badly bruised Chad. It was clear to Ichigo that his friend had shielded the other two from the collapse, although from Izuru's look, his friend had not managed to shield them from all of it. Renji meanwhile looked like a mess. His regeneration was at work on healing him, but it was clear it would take some time for it. Urahara was kneeling, lightly bruised, and breathing deeply, under an arc of rubble that seemed to have shielded him from the worst of it, an arc that was clearly being held in place by a single, large if tin band of purple energy. Ichigo's guess was that Urahara had managed to set up the band so that the fall of the debris had been slowed so much that it looked like it was standing still, and that was how he'd saved himself. Meanwhile, in the middle of the devastation, the least hurt out of anybody but Ichigo, Kenpeki was laughing to the sky, the sound deep, low, and undeniably happy. Now that is what I call fighting properly. When Ichigo instinctive step forward made the stones around him crumble slightly, the captain turned toward him immediately, his grin growing larger and more manic as he saw that Ichigo had been left practically unharmed by the prison's collapse. "And looks like somebody isn't down for the count yet. You really are something, kid," What was your name again? Ichigo Kurosaki. I thought introductions were to be made at the beginning of the battle. Kenpeiga didn't answer for a moment, instead kneeling to punch through the debris. When he pulled his hand out of the refuse a moment later, his Zanpakuto was back in his hand, looking ever more chipped and with additional scratches than it had before. That would be, Kurosaki, because the actual fight is only starting now. You weren't worth remembering before. He then cocked his head to the side, his bells ringing, as he added. Also, did you not want to win? You should have attacked me when I was distracted. You're saying you wouldn't have dodged. Kenpeiga's expression turned into a frown as he answered, sounding annoyed. That's no reason not to try. He was just waiting for the right time to strike. Urahara's voice caused Kenpeiga's eyes to widen in surprise, and was the signal for Ichigo to use his full bringer jump on the air that was still saturated with Ryotsu from when he'd shrunk his blade to fling himself forward, while Kenpeiga's attempt to dodge was stymied by the rope of purple energy Urahara had wrapped around the captain's heel. Even as Kenpeiga glared at the rope and broke it, Ichigo made his Zanpakuto grow, trusting the sword's spirit took care to give it a cutting edge, aiming to simply spear the captain through. The blade growth was instantaneous, but Kenpeiga had somehow anticipated the attack angle with an ease that spoke of long practice, so that instead of cutting through his chest, the hit only speared through the captain's shoulder and left arm. Then, before Ichigo could do anything else, Kenpeiga closed his left hand onto the enlarged Zanpakuto's blade and swung down, smashing Ichigo straight into the rubble. Pain erupted all over Ichigo's body as he felt his nose break and several of his other bones cracking from the sheer strength of the impact. That's sad, you really need to work on your durability, Kurosaki. Ichigo didn't answer, focusing on drawing some Ryotsu from his Zanpakuto to settle his nose and clear his vision. While he listened for Kenpeiga's advancing steps, he even closed his eyes, focusing on his spiritual sense to get a better idea for the huge man's movement, his soul filled with so much more Ryotsu than anybody else that it was impossible to mistake. Then, when Kenpeiga raised his sword to spear him through, the motion almost annoyed as his soul shone with disappointment, Ichigo acted. He used repulsive Hakuta from his side to push himself to the side, his full bringer ability having made the ground slippery enough to make the maneuver work, and then he combined using Hakuta on his leg with turning the ground elastic to bounce to his feet faster than even Kenpeiga could. The Med Captain grinned as he redirected his sword to disembowel Ichigo, but he put Getsuga Tensho in the way and unleashed a black blast from it that pushed Kenpeiga's Zanpakuto's blade away while leaving another dent in it, while Ichigo struck with his own Zanpakuto straight toward Kenpeiga's head. The attack aimed at the man's blind spot due to the eye patch. Somehow, Kenpeiga still managed to move his head out of the way just enough that the attack only cut through the eye patch and left a small, minor cut over the captain's eye, and then Ichigo wasn't able to do anything but fall to the ground as his muscles bent under an impossible weight and his breath disappeared, while the spiritual pressure around him tripled in size in a change so sudden, Ichigo's heart missed a beat from the shock of it. Well, I suppose that's as far as this can go. Ichigo focused on himself, using Hakuta to harden his skin against the Ryotsu pushing down on him, slowly regulating his breath. Still, he knew he wasn't going to have the time to really muster his strength before Kenpeiga could finish him off, so it was with relief that he heard Urahara ask, his voice raspy from the effort. How? Kenpeiga turned toward Urahara, looking at him with clear annoyance. You, of all people, should know that the 12th Division has created a number of devices that can seal Ryotsu away. I just constantly wear one that limits my access to only 1/3 of my total Ryotsu at a time. It wouldn't be fun to fight otherwise. Ichigo considered the other man's definition of fun even as he watched some of the smaller pieces of debris slowly crumbling under Kenpeiga's spiritual pressure, while Urahara continued to speak, sounding even more annoyed than the Shinigami captain had. Not what I meant. So much Ryotsu cannot be reached normally. Not by anything but Minos Grande. How have you achieved this? What sort of research made you? Research? You trying to insult me, Urahara? Ichigo felt Kenpeiga's steps as he changed the direction he was moving, heading toward the scientist as he continued to speak. This is the result of simple hard work. Everybody knows that Zanpakuto collect Ryotsu through their lives to form their soul, stealing it from the wielder and their kills. I simply didn't let anything of mine be stolen. The sword keeps trying to compound the Ryotsu inside itself, and I take it for myself, condensing it inside my body. And thus, my souls becomes denser and denser, making me faster and stronger. Ichigo had managed to get back to his feet now, although laboriously, and was able to see as Urahara looked furious at the explanation, even managing to collect enough outrage to shout back. That's madness. A Zanpakuto's Ryotsu, the feeling it carries, they're not human ones. Fusing those within your own soul will damage your very soul, make it so that the purpose of a weapon, to fight and kill, becomes muddled with your personal goals. It makes it so that you start feel what a sword would when cutting people apart throughout your body, makes you feel less like a man and more like a weapon. Kenpeki had reached the point where Urahara was lying, and knelt to pat him on the head as he said, sounding deeply self-satisfied as he grinned widely. You're saying that like it's a bad thing, you're telling me nothing I didn't already know. Urahara blanched at that, and all of the outrage got out of him as he asked, his eyes filled with incomprehension. Why? Why would anybody do that to themselves? For fun, of course. Ichigo wasn't sure what to think of Urahara's breakdown, but Kenpeka's explanation brought to mind to him something he'd tried but never actually used in battle, sending his own emotions toward his own Zanpakuto. When he'd done it with his rage, in those few moments his mind had been entirely clear, so he wanted to try, see if it would give him a way to escape their monstrous enemy. The only thing stopping him was the worry that, if Urahara was right, using such an ability might hurt his Zanpakuto. If we only do it for a brief moment, it will hopefully not hurt me too much. Also, if Urahara is right, the risk would be of making me more human. That's a risk I'd be willing to take for you, Ichigo. He couldn't help but feel grateful for that, and with a long breath, he sent all of his fear to his Zanpakuto, leaving himself completely focused, empty of any worry. And when he did, the solution presented itself, so obvious he wondered why he hadn't thought of it before. With the Hujioku, he could control Shiro, force him to let Ichigo borrow his power, and no matter how powerful the ability of a Zanpakuto to cut through things could get, Shiro was simply unstoppable. A single Shiro beam fired at the right time would win this battle in just one strike. I thought we agreed you wouldn't rely on the Hollow to win your fights, if we could do it on our own? Ichigo felt a bit of frustration at this, so he sent that emotion away as well, and made it clear that they didn't have any other options, and also that they should hurry, since Kenpeki, after smacking Urahara's face into the debris to knock him out, was heading toward the only other person still standing, that being Izuru down in the courtyard. We do have an option, if you trust me. Close your eyes. Ichigo didn't hesitate a moment to trust his sword spirit, and when he closed his eyes, he found himself in his inner world, facing the old man with his long coat and windswept black hairs, standing in front of him with a serious expression. Ichigo also felt as the emotions he'd sent to the sword returned to him, his worry as whether this could work or not quickly rising. You said you have an idea. The old man nodded, then said, in a serious tone. I never told you how comes I lost my last Shinigami, did I? Though you weren't ready to give him your Bankai. That's one way to put it, but it's not fully correct. The old man started to pace, his voice and expression clearly sad, as he explained. In truth, I never had the chance. A Zanpakuto can only give power to their wielder once they have gained self-awareness, and that is something which is gained through the experiences we go through. The experience that gave me my self-awareness was the death of my previous owner. The reason I didn't help him live isn't because I didn't want to, it's because I wasn't able to. Ichigo was let surprised by that, and unsure how to react. It didn't seem as if he needed to do anything, however, as the Zanpakuto spirit turned to watch Ichigo and said, in a serious tone. Which is why I won't let the same happen to you, Ichigo. I want you to have my power, but I wasn't sure how to give it form, since it's something I never did before. That piqued Ichigo's curiosity. You needed to figure it out? Those Zanpakuto simply had the power within themselves, for the Shinigami to take. The old man shook his head. Not at all. The power is a result of our soul's understanding of each other. It's not like Bankai, that combines our souls into a single being, but it needs to be an expression of what the Zanpakuto understands of the personality of their Shinigami, so that they can wield that power properly, as well as an expression of what the Zanpakuto's wishes to gain from the partnership. That takes time to fully understand the relationship, and while a normal Zanpakuto would have gained most of that understanding while their soul was forming, I didn't have that. Ichigo nodded, feeling the solemnity of the moment as he said. I think I understand. Can I ask why now? Is it just because I wanted to risk using the hollow? Not at all, it's because I want you to show this man what he's losing, by treating his Zanpakuto the way he has, and because by seeing him, I know, finally, what I want from this partnership between us. I see. The sword spirit smiled. Maybe, if not, you will soon enough. Do you accept my power, Ichigo Kurosaki? Ichigo gratefully clasped the offered hand as he nodded, and the old man spoke again, in a satisfied tone. Then go, I'll explain as we fight, we have no time to waste. My name is Zanjitsu, and my pact is to learn. Ichigo felt it as the command impressed itself into his very soul, his Ryutsu suddenly surging, he blinked, and his eyes opened on the courtyard again, the awakening of his Shikai causing Kenpeki to pause in his stride and turn, looking first with surprise, then with eagerness, to the weapon in Ichigo's hands. Well, seems like you had some trick left after all. Why wait so long to use it? Ichigo looked at the blade in his right hand, seeing it for the first time. Zanjitsu released form looked like an oversized knife, the blade as long as he was tall yet feeling lighter than his previous normal-sized katana form had. Most of the blade was black, but where Getsuga was black in full, blade and edge both, Zanjitsu's edge was silver, and glinting somewhat. The sword had no crossguard, but the handle was far longer than even a two-handed sword would normally have, and white bandages were wrapped around it several times. It felt right in his hand, and while it didn't have the sense of power that Getsuga transmitted to him, it felt like it held untold amounts of untapped potential. Feeling his confidence returning at the feeling of the blade in his hands, Ichigo looked Kenpeki straight in his eyes and said, forcing his confidence that they could win this to the forefront. I just obtained it. But now that I have my own Shikai to face yours with, you'll be going down. Shikai? What are you blabbing about? That gave Ichigo pause for a moment. So extending your power to your whole body isn't a Shikai ability. Kenpeki scoffed at that. Didn't you listen what I said to the trickster? I don't need any Shikai, because my whole body is a weapon. Weapons are meant to cut things apart, so that's what I do, that's all there's is to it. Do you understand now? Focus on the pressure over your skin, feel how it pushes you down. Ichigo obeyed Zanjitsu's command, focusing on the sense of pressure pushing him down, and after a moment, he suddenly felt lighter, almost as if he was being buoyed upwards instead. The feeling went away after a moment, but then come back, and after 3 heartbeats, Ichigo was managing to go from feeling weighted down to feeling lightened up. Then he put himself in a guard position, Zanjitsu in forward guard with Getsuga to the side, and said with all of his confidence. Not really. Why don't you show me? Kenpeki looked annoyed, but then shook his head, bloodlust taking over his expression. Figures. If that's what you want, then here I come. And then, the man jumped forward, his strength much greater than it had been before, so that the jump carried him through the entire distance in barely 2 heartbeats, but just as the sword was falling, Ichigo moved, his weightless body making the dodge almost effortless. The pressure returned for a moment as he breathed in, then he was weightless again as he swung, the lack of weight being just enough to compensate for his enemy's greater speed, allowing him to score a cut on Kenpeki's already wounded left arm, leaving it unresponsive. Kenpeki laughed as he swung back, and Ichigo dodged by moving backwards as he was weightless, while using the moment where the pressure was pushing down on him again to regain his footing, before going for a solid swing again. However, much as he was keeping up, he was not actually faster than Kenpeki, and so when the man intercepted, Zanjitsu was blocked, the pain from the sheer strength of the impact reverberating through his body, even as he thrust with Getsuga, the spear of black Ryutsu that erupted from the blade's tip pushing Kenpeki away. Ichigo could feel his limbs still trembling from the power of the attack he'd been hurt by, but at the same time, he felt a sudden surge of strength in them, and grinned as Zanjitsu explained. Whenever you're on the receiving end of a power, you'll gain the ability to use the same power, as his Ryutsu press down on you, it'll give you the ability to ignore a similar amount of push, and whenever you receive a powerful hit, you'll be able to deliver a similar one back. This isn't permanent, only until you've used the power, and you need to survive the hit in the first place, but so long as you do, I know you'll be able to use the strength your enemies have better than they ever would. Now go, and prove to this bastard why he shouldn't underestimate the bond between Shinigami and Zanpakuto. Ichigo didn't need to be told twice, taking advantage of a moment of weightlessness combined with an Hakuto repulsive push and making himself even lighter with Ho-Oh to dash toward Kenpeka faster than the Shinigami captain expected him to move, getting inside his guard as he swung with all the force of Kenpeka's block, the blade biting in his side until he managed to slam his knee into Ichigo's belly with enough power to send him flying, while also bleeding from the stab wound. He allowed himself a small grin at the sight of Kenpeka checking his bleeding side, even though the madman was also smiling, before a net waved out of purple ropes interrupted his fall. Even so, as he knelt next to Urahara, he could feel himself getting weaker, at least until Hanataro tapped him on the side and took the wound away, allowing him to get back on his feet. As he looked around, he found that Renji and Izuru were right next to him, the blonde smacking slab after slab of broken building with his sword before kicking them at Kenpeka, clearly trying to buy time. The redhead, on the other hand, looked impossibly tired and, Ichigo noticed, his blade was back to its fully sealed form. At the look, he shook his head and explained, in a croak. When he took apart my Bankai at the same time as collapsing the building on me, my power drained itself to keep me alive. I won't be able to call back on Zabumaru for a couple hours at least. I can't even run properly, let alone fight, with my Ryotsu as depleted as it is. Urahara didn't look in as bad a condition, Hanataro clearly having healed him just moment before, but his tone was much more grim. Chad and Momo are both out of it. Hanataro said Momo was wounded the way you were when we recovered you, which means Jin might be around somewhere, and with all this ice around, I'm guessing Toshiro led him away during their fight. We can't win against two captains, and even if we could somehow manage, it won't matter if it takes long enough that reinforcements arrive, especially when we have wounded Takari and no good mean of making a run for it. Ichigo grimaced, admitting to himself that the situation really was that bad, even as he glanced upwards to where Kenpeka, apparently bored of slashing to piece everything Izuru was throwing him or being smacked by the things he missed, had impaled one of the largest stones thrown his way and was using it as a shield as he charged at them. He waited matter for a moment more, then said, I think I just might be able to take him down with a good strike. Let me launch one last attack, and if it doesn't work, it should at least give us enough cover to make a run for it. Izuru grimaced and asked, what if he manages to pin you? Urahara, who had knelt to take the unconscious girl in his arms, answered for Ichigo, sounding very confident. I'll get him out. I have a few hideouts nobody should know about, and can lead Ichigo there. You four should start to go already. In fact, the more time you have, the better. What about Momo? Renji needs Hanataro to support him, and unlike you, I'm not strong enough to carry Sato, and Ichigo needs to be free to fight. We'll make sure she's safe, you take care of yourselves. Izuru nodded, and they quickly began to head away, even as Ichigo himself charged at Kenpeka, swinging with Getsuga Tensho to send a cutting line of black Ryotsu at the man's improvised shield. The attack, as Ichigo had hoped, cut straight through and then pushed Kenpeka backwards, stumbling if unhurt. Then Ichigo jumped, sheathing Getsuga as he did to grab Zanjutsu with both hands, and focused on pouring all the Ryotsu he could into the blade. He found that if he wanted he could make it change size, but instead, it felt like simply making the sword denser and thus more lethal was an easier effect to achieve on the Shikai blade. Kenpeka raised his damaged blade into a guard position, but just as he was striking, with the full additional impact of the jump and his sword as weighty as he could make it, Ichigo put all the strength from Kenpeka's last attack into the hit. Zanjutsu smashed into the enemy's Zanpakuto and pushed it back with barely any slowdown, to Kenpeka's absolute surprise, since he'd not expected such strength behind the hit. The sword bit deeply into the man's shoulder blade and more lightly into his chest, before the monster managed to muster his strength and push Ichigo back. Zanjutsu's silvery edge was left undamaged by the clash as he rolled to his feet, while Kenpeka fell down on his back with a resounding crash as the broken masonry gave up under his weight. Well done. Ichigo let out a long breath, then quickly jumped back toward Urahara and said, with a grin. See? Told you I had one last good hit in me. Urahara nodded, even as Ichigo took out a long breath and returned Zanjutsu to its unreleased shape as a normal katana. He turned, trying to see if Izuru and the others were still in sight, when suddenly he heard the sound of stones breaking as they were thrown aside with impossible strength. "Where do you think you're going? We'd just started to have fun." A shiver went through Ichigo's spine as he turned in the direction of the debris, to see that Kenpei's bleeding form had climbed out of them. Looking more than ready to keep going, the man jumped, landing in front of Ichigo with a strong enough impact to make the earth shake, and only Urahara dragging him away managed to save Ichigo from being beheaded by Kenpei's swing. Kenpei's expression shifted to anger at that. "What is this fear? Have you lost the will to fight? Should I just kill you?" Ichigo didn't know what to answer, but before he could a wave of blue fire invested Kenpei, and while most of it didn't hurt him at all, every single one of the wounds Ichigo had inflicted the Shinigami captain caught fire, causing him to step backwards in pain. That was when a very familiar scaled figure with a white lizard mask landed straight in front of Ichigo, saying in a cocky tone and an even more familiar voice, "Nobody is gonna kill my friend, you bastard. Tatsuki." She turned to him, and even though she looked like in hollow, Ichigo could feel the happiness in her voice. "Ichigo. I was worried something bad had happened to you. What's going on here?" Urahara answered for him, gesturing for them to start running. "We need to escape, but the madman is not letting us." As if to confirm those words, Kenpei, who seemed to have somehow put out the flames on his wounds, started running in their direction as he shouted, furious. "This is the most fun I've had in decades, I'm not going to let you cut it short." Tatsuki nodded, and Ichigo couldn't help but grin to himself at how quickly his friend had grasped the situation. "Right, let's take care of that." She waved her hands, and jets of blue flames erupted from them, hitting all of the ice in the courtyard at once, creating a very thick mist that made it difficult to see a few meters past their faces. Ichigo smiled in appreciation, but Urahara said instead, in a warning tone, "This won't be enough, it'll slow him down, but he'll use his spiritual sense to find us again. Not if I distract him." "What?" Ichigo turned toward Tatsuki, who answered in a tone that would accept no argument. "I've a device with me that makes me invisible to spiritual senses, and I can regenerate from any wounds he inflicts on me. I can play bait and delay until you have gotten away, and then I'll hide and escape." Ichigo wasn't happy to hear that. "He's invulnerable, other than Zero or pouring more flames into his open wounds. I don't think you can hurt him in any way." Tatsuki grinned again, and answered, "Good thing I only need to play keep away then, isn't it? Go, the sooner you escape the sooner I do." Ichigo nodded, bumping his fist against hers before leaving, much as he might not like it, trusting his friend was the only thing he could do right now. Chapter 54, Fire. Tatsuki nodded to herself as Ichigo and Urahara turned to go, and then turned toward where she could feel the almost blindingly huge amount of riot so that indicated their opponent's position. It'd be pretty hard to miss. The man was stumbling in their direction, moving slowly but with growing decisiveness. That, Tatsuki decided, wouldn't do at all. She focused a moment, then made two brief Sonido pushes in rapid succession, turning slightly after the first so that she was now on the opposite side from their opponent in respect to where she'd been before. She took a breath to let her cracking bones repair themselves from the damage the acceleration inflicted them, as she always had to after using the ability, and then shouted at the top of her lungs. "Hey, big bastard, I'm this way." The man turned to glare at her, and Tatsuki had the time to take a good look at the wounds Ichigo had left on him. Aside from having about a dozen small cuts all over his body, the big thing was that his left arm was incapacitated by two deeper cuts, and of course, there was the bleeding wounds between his left shoulder and collarbone. That was a bit worrying. Something like that ought to have taken anybody down, but when the wounded man was letting out such a feeling of dread, it only added a bit to his generally intimidating presence. He also glared with clear annoyance once he saw it was her who had challenged him, and shouted, "Stop interfering, you're not the one I seek to fight. Make me then." Even as she answered, she let the fire flow free from her arms, sending it at him in a big blue wave that set his wounds on fire again, except this time, she kept feeding more and more fire to the wave, trying to push as much of it inside the wounds as she could. She might also be enjoying the man's scream of pain a bit more than she should, but then again, he was trying to kill Ichigo, so she wasn't going to feel bad for it. However, after a moment, she realized what she was hearing wasn't a cry of pain, it was laughter. Tatsuki was left confused by that, but didn't stop throwing fire around. However, the man stood still for a moment, and then Tatsuki felt herself being crushed by a powerful force, so strong it stopped air from coming to her lungs for a moment. And, more importantly, it stopped the air from feeding her fires as well, stopping her onslaught as well as putting out the burning flames filling her enemy's wounds. Then I'll just kill you. The crushing pressure disappeared, and the man charged at her with a very annoyed glare on his face. Tatsuki let out another wave of fire with both hands, but this time, he swung his blade as he was charging, and the blade cut through the flames, deflecting them away and opening him a pathway to reach her. Tatsuki immediately used Sonito to push herself backwards and away, but that just meant that the Shinigami charged at her again. Tatsuki considered if she could simply keep using the ability to maintain her distance until she was sure Ichigo had escaped, but when the Shinigami landed from his second charge, missing her, his foot didn't stop on the ground, instead somehow smashing through the rock like a pick. The sheer strength behind the strike created a spiderweb of cracks on the ground spreading from the impact point, and while Tatsuki stumbled from it, her opponent did not, having been prepared for the effect of his own attack, and used it to close on her. Knowing she didn't have the room to escape, she dodged to the left instead, using Hakuta to channel a feeling of calm to the Ryutsu under her feet, giving it water-like properties to help her slide past the falling sword. She tried to punch at the Shinigami with a fist charged in repulsive Hakuta to force him away, but upon striking, she felt the bones in her hand shattering, and while the hit did move him backwards slightly, the shock from the unexpected, incredible pain in her fingers kept her from taking advantage of the opening. When her opponent countered with a knee strike, she jumped, using Ho-Ho to make herself lighter, and stabbed the blade growing from her forearm into the large cut in his collarbone. The blade entered for a brief moment before stopping, as if the inside of the wound itself was as impenetrable as the rest of him, so Tatsuki charged the Ryutsu around it with affection, in order to force the blade to stick inside, before grasping with her other hand and perching on his shoulder with her feet, and forcing all of those to stick to her enemy as well. It was incredibly uncomfortable, but with it made it awkward for the man to strike at her, so Tatsuki held onto it, even as she let her blue flames erupt from the blade straight inside the wound, pumping more and more within it. The man attempted to fob her off with a stab from his other hand, but she dodged the first, and then slammed her feet into the inside elbow of his sword arm and then used Hakuta to stick it there, keeping him from moving his arm. He looked surprised at the way she was stopping his attacks, and she took immediate advantage of that to let out a torrent of fire shot out from the crest atop her head and straight into his mouth, trying to burn him from the inside. For a moment, she could feel the flames expanding inside his stomach, and he was clearly starting to suffocate, but then he moved to headbutt her forward far faster than she expected such a big man to move, and when it smashed into her chest in a cacophony of ringing bells in astounding pain, it was almost instinctive to charge all her Ryutsu with repulsion, to get away from the pain. It worked, and in fact, it worked far better than she'd expected it to. It took her a moment to realize that, in addition to her own body, she had accidentally fueled the disgust charge to all the Ryutsu connected to her, including the very fire that was erupting from her body. The possibility that the blue fire could be affected the same way as her body with Hakuta had never been something she'd thought of, but she had little time to think the matter over, as the combination of the super strong repulsive push she'd used and the already tremendous strength of the headbutt sent her crashing into and then through the prison courtyard's walls, and then further along the street, into a nearby house. She managed to use Hakuta to harden her back just in time, crashing into the wall rather than being smeared against it, but then had to lay there, as the regeneration had a lot to fix, and was doing it somewhat more sluggishly than usual. She could still see the figure of her opponent through the debris smoke caused by her crushing through the wall, mostly because it was illuminated by the blue flames that were alight over his body. For a moment, she dared to hope that she'd managed to immolate him from the inside after all, but then she felt the terrifying, breath-stealing pressure from before, and as it extinguished the flames, she heard steps heading her way. In a moment of insight, she realized he'd been standing still the last time he'd used the ability, as well, meaning he probably needed to stop moving to put out any fires she set on him. She was still recovering as the man emerged from the cloud of dust and stopped to locate her past it. He spoke, smoke coming out of his mouth as he did. "You are the one who fought with Yachiroa, aren't you?" It took a moment for Tatsuki to place the name, but then she remembered Urahara had used it for the kid with pink hairs. Seeing no reason to deny it, She hadn't even hurt her, after all. Tatsuki nodded, not yet sure her lungs and thorax had reformed fully. It seemed to be enough for the man, for he grinned, his teeth gleaming in the night. She wasn't wrong then, when she said you were a strong fighter. Tatsuki was perplexed, but as the man resumed his walk in her direction, she slowly got to her feet, a hand on her chest as it finished knitting itself together. While her opponent didn't stop, a look of surprise appeared in his eyes, before his grin widened. And it seems you're beyond the normal limitation of hollows as well, if your wound is regenerating like that. Tatsuki frowned, having no idea what the madman was talking about, but her inner hollow spoke up, in her usual dismissive tone at Tatsuki's ignorance. When a Zanpakuto strikes in hollow, it siphons away their Ryutsu, instead of simply parting it from the rest. That slows regeneration down substantially, and can even allow a Shinigami to literally cut an hollow down to nothing. But with you as a filter, when he cuts at you, it's your soul that is targeted, not mine. I simply pour Ryutsu in the wounds, where it turns into your own. It allows you to recover quickly from wounds that a normal hollow would be incapacitated by for a significantly longer time, such as the one you just took. While Tatsuki filed that data away, the man, unaware of her internal debate, asked another question, sounding quite eager. What is your name, girl? She took a deep breath, confirming her lungs were back in working order, then answered, even as she readied herself for her next move. Tatsuki Arisawa. Does it matter? When I am the one who asks, it always does. I am Zaraki Kenpeki, and you're the second one today to have proved able to really hurt me. Also, you've stolen a fight I was looking forward to, so you better give me another one in exchange, hold nothing back, or I'll make you regret it. And with that, Kenpeki charged at her. Tatsuki wasn't yet feeling well enough to try Sonido again, considering how most of her body was still regenerating and had barely been put back together, so she used Ho-Ho to jump, with repulsive Hakuta used to gain more altitude. However, the moment she did, Kenpeki jumped as well, and while she couldn't tell if he was using some technique or if it was just a matter of being that strong, it was clear that her jump would give her enough altitude to dodge him. In a bout of panic, she kicked out a fire blast at him, even though she knew that wouldn't give her any extra distance, except, she realized suddenly, it could. She tried to charge the Ryutsu the blue flames were made of with repulsion again, and it worked, pushing her backwards and away from her opponent. It didn't harm the man himself, but also pushed him backward from his jump, unbalancing him and causing him to smash back first into the street, which was good, because Tatsuki herself was having trouble controlling her movement. At least, until she had the idea of using the same ability that had left her out of balance to remedy the problem. With a thought, she created a large sheet of fire around her limbs, using her ability to control them for a moment while she charged it with feelings of repulsion once again. That slowed her descent down, like a glider, allowing Tatsuki to land relatively softly. She heard the laugh from Kenpeki as the man got back to her feet, as he shouted. That's it. Keep trying new things to kill me, make this a fight to remember. Tatsuki didn't bother answering, she certainly had no reason to indulge the madman. She'd already given Ichigo enough time to escape, now it was time for her to do the same. Kenpeki, however, had different ideas. The moment she turned to run away, he shouted with a gleeful tone. Where do you think you're going? I won't let another fight escape me. She glanced back a moment before turning the corner, and her eyes widened as she saw he push his hand into a nearby wall, the finger piercing through as if it was made of butter, before he ripped a whole chunk of masonry out of the wall and threw it at her with superhuman strength. Even as she turned the corner, Tatsuki could hear the sound of the house collapsing due to its wall having been demolished, a moment before the stone and brick smashed in the wall to her side and bounced off and onto her in a rain of deadly debris. She curled on herself and used Hakuta to harden her body from the barrage, before she let out a curtain of fire around herself and expanded it, infusing it with determination to shield herself from the attack. A moment later, Kenpeki's sword sliced straight through, and she barely managed roll through the other side of it, and only because she'd already opened it to slip away. Even as she did, she willed the fire to flow into her opponent's wounds once again. She'd have tried his mouth too, but he was keeping it closed as he smiled with gritted teeth, but once again, he easily snuffed them out, the pressure having the side effect to cause Tatsuki to stumble as he did. With the flames down, the man spoke again as he advanced. his tone eager. The same trick won't work on me twice, show me something else. Tatsuki's answer was to send a wave of blue fire at him again, but she could feel as she tried that she wasn't going to be able to fill him with fire again. Her control was good, but not enough to get the fire in smaller openings like his ears or nostrils. She did manage to set his wounds on fire again and used the temporary distraction, but once again, he managed to snuffle those out. It at least allowed her to make it through another hallway and across 2 more corners, but before she could even try to go for her suppression device, the wall suddenly exploded as Kenpeki emerged through it, apparently having gone through the houses and destroying them to reach her, as he now stood in front of her, looming menacingly. I told you already, I'm not going to let you get away with denying me my fight. Tatsuki grimaced, but with the hollow mask on her face sporting a beak of sort, she doubted the frustration could be detected by the man in front of her. She also knew the only way she was getting away was if she managed to find a way to trap the man, which meant she had to fight him, rather than continuing to escape. So she put as much cockiness as she could into her voice and shouted back. Fine, if you want to die so much, I'll let you have your wish. Once again, she sent a wave of fire at him, this time imbuing it with determination to harden it, to the point it was more of an avalanche than a simple wave. Meanwhile, she let more fire form all along the crest on her back, and the moment Kenpeki committed to slash down at the wave of fire in front of him, she sent those to circle around, to strike at him from the side. For a moment, the simple cutting power and strength in the sword slash halted the fire avalanche, breaking through the front of it. However, as Tatsuki pushed more and more flames into the wave, the accumulating power sent the man stumbling back enough that he didn't have time to counter the streams of fire entering the open wounds, at least not immediately. Taking advantage of the connection of the fire to her body, she sent determination and affection through the connection, hardening the fire until it filled the entirety of the wounds and stuck to them as close as possible. A moment later, the sudden crushing pressure struck, and it was enough to both snuff out and shatter the streams of fire she was summoning. However, as she'd hoped, it wasn't enough to snuff the fire she'd filled into her wounds. She grinned in satisfaction at her plan succeeding, and then was caught off guard as the man grinned back, as he kept focusing his pressure, clearly planning to smother the fire out by keeping the pressure up. Tatsuki wasn't sure what to think of it, but with the man forced to stand still, she thought it was a good moment to escape. However, she barely had the time to use Hakuta to coat her shoulders so that she could move under the pressure and take a couple steps backwards, when suddenly the pressure disappeared. Immediately, the flames in Kenpeki's wounds started to burn more furiously, to which the Shinigami said, through gritted teeth that were somehow fashioned into a grin. It might be painful, but having fire burning inside my body isn't going to kill me. Pull out something stronger. If you want to kill me with fire, you need to make it burn hotter. As he charged forward, she darted backwards with Sonito, while unleashing more hardened flames straight at him. This time however, instead of taking them on, he dodged, reversing his sword's grip so that his fingers could scrape the wall as he ran, thus making him able to throw the whole fistful of shattered bricks at her when he saw her bracing for another bout of Sonito. While individually small, the strength at which he threw them made them move as fast as arrows, and when Tatsuki hardened her skin with Hakuta to resist the attack, he did it again and again as he closed the distance. Realizing that trying to keep the man away wouldn't work, Tatsuki let out a wave of blue fire that was charged with all of her anger and frustration, and she could almost see the strike of red fire that mixed with the blue as her anger mixed with the red, and realized she'd seen it before, when fighting the Ice Boy. Knowing that it would work made it easier to feed all of her anger into the flames, making them swirl with burning power. She'd dodged down even as she'd sent fire at the projectiles, but nothing survived it. All that got through was ashes, the stones and bricks having been incinerated by the sheer heat of her attack. She was left surprised by it for a moment, but then a sudden shout as Kenpeki lunged forward immediately sent her senses in overdrive, and she jumped, using Ho-Ho as well as Sonito and combining it with repulsion-charged fire in a reactive dodge she wouldn't be able to replicate consciously, but also one that perfectly put her exactly above her enemy. Seizing the chance, she unleashed more fire but held the attack for just a moment, in order to shape it like a huge fireball, one large enough to fully obscure her form, before she hardened it and commanded it to fall down like a meteor. Then, taking advantage of being hidden, she let out another pulse of repulsive fire and used it to push herself far away enough that, when she started to let herself fall, She thought she was at least 5 streets away, hopefully enough that it would let her escape. Except that, before she had fallen under the level of the house roofs, Kenpeki erupted from what looked like a huge jump, his sword held up high above his head, flames sliding along his body even as those inside his wounds continued to burn. The only way he could have done that, Tatsuki knew, was if he'd simply jumped through and cut through her entire improvised meteor, as ridiculous as that sounded. And, judging from the eager glare he was fixing her with, he was not going to let her escape. She closed her eyes for a moment to better sense his movements as she fell out of his line of sight, and she could feel him using a roof as a jumping platform to reach her. At the same time a loud smashing sound echoed through. Even as she knew, from the trajectory of his jump, that he'd land in the very same street she was on, Tatsuki started to run, hoping to at least put some distance between them. When he smashed into one of the walls rather than the paved street, slightly overshooting the jump due to having put excessive force into it, she sent a thin stream of fire at him to strike as fast as she could. It didn't work, however, as he'd smashed into the wall with his left side, and thus was able to swing his sword into the attack, swatting the fire away with it. Then, as he lifted himself from the crater in the wall he'd caused, his sword cut into the ground, leveraging one of the giant's paving stones, and then, gripping it with his one working hand, he threw it at her like a discus. Tatsuki panicked for a moment at the sight, and she knew she couldn't muster the anger to burn through something that big in such a state, fear making it hard to muster anger, but then suddenly realized she didn't need to, and as confidence and determination filled her, she let it flow out of her and feed it to the fire she willed to erupt from all over her body, and fan out in front of her like a wall. The stone was large enough, and the strength behind it powerful enough for it to power through the fire wall, but Tatsuki had known that would happen. What the hardened fire did was slow the attack down for her to have the time to add affection and repulsion to large portions of it at targeted spots, and use it to let her redirect the stone's movement with her own fire. The stone stood suspended in front of her for a moment, immobile as it was suspended into a cloud of fire, before it started to spin on itself in place, slowly gaining more and more speed. As she looked past the curtain of flames in front of her, to see where she should aim, she found that Kenpeki seemed to be waiting still, bloodthirsty grin on his face, as if wanting to see what she would do before he committed to either blocking or dodging. What she did was to send just enough anger along the very edge of the fire she was making stick to the border of the stone, and then unleashed as much revulsion as she could, sending it flying back at 3 times the speed it'd been flung at her. Kenpeki apparently tried to both dodge and block it at once, as he swung his sword in the stone's path even as he dodged to the left. The sword cut through, although for a moment it seemed to Tatsuki that the edge of it was melting, and the right portion fell to the wayside, but the left one, even with a good deal of lost momentum due to the cut, still smacked straight into Kenpeki's abdomen, sending him stumbling back with a cry of pain. She blinked, and then a second look showed that the strike had left a big, black scorch mark on his abdomen, the scarring worse than even the worst she'd ever seen. She was left stunned for a moment, and her inner hollow's voice was mocking, even as she could see the exultant tone inside it. Of course our fire can burn through anything. Did you not notice how it melted the white Shinigami's ice straight into his leg? No normal fire could do something like that. Nothing can stand up to our flames. Tatsuki doubted the hollow had realized it any more than she herself had, since in that case she would have been crowding about it the whole time, but before she had time to set the record with the hollow straight on the matter, her attention was called to Kenpeki, who was now speaking. That's what I was talking about. Is burning me alive your plan? Or do you have more? Show me. She didn't let him charge forward, instead sending a dozen of streams of fire at him from her back, each shaped into a sharpened point and hardened with disdain, and with a small bit of burning red anger on every tip. Kenpeki grinned, swiping his sword in front of it to deflect many of them away as he charged forward, but he also dodged and crouched as he did, trying to avoid most of the attacks. Even so, as a few still managed to score glancing blows on his already wounded left side as they did, leaving small but clearly visible cuts along his unresponsive arm, a clear sign she could use this to wound him now. This just seemed to excite him further, however, as he started to scrape the ground with his feet whenever they hit the ground, creating clouds of dust to partially hide his advance and making it harder for Tatsuki to aim her attacks in a way that would wound him, even as he inexorably got closer and closer. Seeing as she was in no rush to go hand-to-hand with a superhumanly strong veteran fighter who clearly was looking for exactly that kind of brawl, she focused instead on the burning bonfire that the other half of her throne stone had created, which was slowly spreading on the street as it burned away to the paving stones, and forced it to move. While her hollow's power gave her the ability to control, direct and shape all fire she could sense, she could only infuse her emotions in it as she created it, since those were carried by her Ryotsu, which was only in direct contact with her soul. Thus, she couldn't add any effect to the fire she'd summoned, but, since it was still carrying her anger from before, when it slammed into Kenpei's back, the combination of the sudden pain from being burned and the surprise from the sneak attack caused him to stumble. To Tatsuki's amazement, he managed to recover quickly, but luckily, not quickly enough to stop her from sending a single stream of fire, packed with the same determination and affection as before, but this time also as much rage as she could, straight into Kenpei's largest wound. Kenpei let out a roar of pain before shouting, "That's good. Now keep going, because a single wound won't be enough to take me down." And then, to her absolute surprise, he slashed with his sword at the wound, cutting himself deep enough to cause a momentary sprout of blood for a moment. The absurdity of it was enough to stop her from doing anything with the fire in the wound for the brief moment Kenpei needed to suddenly condense his Ryotsu again, and taking advantage of the new space he'd given it to snuff the red and blue flame completely. He grinned, but as she felt the fire disappearing from her senses, she realized he'd had to relax the effect that was keeping him invulnerable from his inside to do what he'd had to lower his defense to be able to cut himself. Thus, the moment he stopped using his Ryotsu and went to raise his blood-dripping sword, she struck, sending a thin stream of blue fight straight into the wound, the minimal amount of fire making the attack go as fast as she could, the thrust of her hand making the motion even faster, and then she pushed the smallest spark of excitement into it through just a finger to minimize the point of contacts before she severed it. Even like that, she felt two of her fingers going numb from the brief contact with her electrified flames. Still, it was worth it for the effect it put on Kenpei, as the fire carried the electricity straight into his blood and nerves through the wound before he could harden it close again. Electricity erupted from his many open wounds as it coursed through his entire body, but she could see he was not even close to defeated. However, she hoped this would keep him paralyzed for just long enough for her to leave. But as she tried to reach for her hollow's Ryotsu to Sonito herself away, she suddenly found resistance coming from the creature. She tried to reach it, as the monster tried to steal control of her power as she shouted in her head. "Why are you escaping? We can kill him. I have given you the power to win, and you want to run instead? I forbid you." Tatsuki felt her body seizing against her will, and immediately focused her full attention on getting control of it, focusing on one muscle at a time, in a manner not dissimilar from some of her martial arts training. Slowly, she felt herself gaining back control of some of her body, but the hollow seemed to focus on the rest more strongly the less it had left, and soon enough they were at a stalemate, with Tatsuki's greater skill countered by the fact they were in the hollow's body, and the hollow knew that deeply and far better than Tatsuki herself did. The fact the hollow was still screeching in her head in outrage didn't help. "I will not let your fear control me, for I have no fear. Instead, we shall kill this man, and then we'll be the one people will fear instead. Every hollow has heard of the Kenpei, the unbeatable hollow hunter and slaughterer, they all fear that name, and by killing him, that fear shall be mine to wield." Tatsuki gritted her teeth, mustering her psychological strength to chase the hollow off. She wasn't about to get herself killed for the sake of the monster's bragging rights. And the hollow seemed to understand that easily enough, as it shouted back at her, furious. "You talk to me of bragging rights, but the truth is just that you fear you'll die. You like to pretend that you're fearless and ready to die for your cause, but when you can't use me to make the risk meaningless anymore, you suddenly only want to flee. You're a coward." For a moment, the words struck at Tatsuki, as she felt herself filled with doubts. Was she only pretending to be brave for her friends, because she couldn't be hurt by it? As she felt the weight of it, her control of her body started to slip, but then she realized that the hollow was wrong, and it was the other way around. To help her friends here, she had to survive at every cost, and if that meant running from a fight, then that was the thing to do. To stay just to satisfy her pride would be the actually selfish things here. With the thoughts giving her a sudden surge of determination, she pushed against the hollow with all of her focus and, when she realized she just couldn't get control of her full body back from her, she instead took control of the hollow's power and forced it away, sealing the creature back once more. The effort caused her to fall to her knees, even as the mask and hollow body receded and Tatsuki was back in her usual clothes. It took her a moment to collect her breath and refocus her scrambled mind, but when she did, she suddenly noticed the huge, threatening presence looming over her. As she looked up, she found Kenpeka standing there, his sword resting over his shoulder as he glared down at her with a frown. Unsure what to say, she waited there until he spoke first, disappointment in his voice. "What's the meaning of this?" She let out a long breath of pain, and answered, trying to make it sound self-deprecating. "Well, I've encountered some difficulties getting my hollow to cooperate. I assure you, if I could choose, I wouldn't have dismissed my hollow form mid-fight." Kenpeka scoffed, and commented, now somewhat amused. "That's the risk with relying on power borrowed from other beings, rather than making the power your own. It's a shortcut to power, and I can appreciate that if nobody ever took one of those I'd have no chance of ever meeting an opponent worth of a fight again, and they're rare enough as is. Still, relying only on yourself is always the better bet." Tatsuki wasn't sure how to answer to the suddenly friendly attitude of the man who had been trying to kill her mere minutes before, but she tried to spin it into getting herself out of there, even as she got back on her feet. "Right. So, I think we could postpone the fight. You give me, let's say, 3 days to pummel my hollow into submission, and we met again after that." He cocked his head, then said in a thoughtful tone, "I have a better idea." Then, the bloodthirsty grin reappeared on his face. "How about I force you to pull out your empowered form again by cutting you until you do?" And then he slashed. It was slower than before. Tatsuki could tell the man was holding back, but even so, she just barely managed to dodge, and, in fact, it wasn't a full dodge, as the tip of his blade cut straight through the bottom half of her shirt, and even the bandages below, which sent the folder with the evidence flying. Tatsuki reacted without thinking, diving for the documents instinctively. The moments her hands closed around them, pain exploded in her lower back, and she found herself with Kenpeka's sword running through her, impaling her through the ground. The man knelt with a frown, and despite the pain it caused her, Tatsuki curled onto herself, to keep him from being able to grasp the folder. He didn't attempt to, however, instead poking her forehead as he asked, "What is that?" She shuddered, as speaking with a sword through her body was, in fact, incredibly painful when she couldn't simply regenerate the damage away, but she still answered, maybe just in a show of stubborn defiance. "The evidence that'll save Rukia." "Rukia? You mean, the Kukaki girl that's under judgment? How's a bunch of paper gonna save her?" She struggled past the pain, trying to think of a way to save herself and answering just to keep Kenpeka at bay. "Because it proves Jin Ichimaru framed her for his own crimes. So, Jin is the one who is guilty of crimes that warranted an execution." Then a sudden gleeful light sparked inside Kenpeka's eyes, as he commented, apparently mostly to himself. "Which means, I can get a proper fight to the death with Jin without getting the old man on my case. Right? Girl." Tatsuki had no idea what he was talking about, but she could feel her strength waning, so she would have been unable to answer anyway. She was still awake enough to hear the tall man mutter, in a worried tone that was completely at odds on him. "Damn, I need her alive to get a proper explanation. I can't let a chance like this pass me by." Then he ripped the sword out of her, and Tatsuki had just the time to feel a sharp instant of incredible pain and get a vague sense that she was being lifted off the ground, before she lost knowledge. Chapter 55, Priorities. Watching Toshiro's body lie still on the bed, his chest barely moving to signal his breathing, he looked even younger than usual. It made it difficult to remember that, much as it might appear otherwise, he was a lieutenant of the Goti I-13, and was, technically, under arrest for attempting to kill a superior officer and assisting in a prison breakout. Turning to watch the silent figure of the silver-haired man at her side, Ranjaku Matsumoto couldn't help but ask, despite already knowing the answer. "Did he really try to kill you?" Somberly, Jin nodded. His eyes were still squinted in his usual manner, but the mere fact he didn't have his customary smirk on his lips was the clearest possible sign that he was deadly serious. Ranjaku let out a long breath, pushing her long hairs behind her head, and said, letting her sadness show in her voice. "It's just that it's so unbelievable, you know? Toshiro always idolized you, saw you as the ideal of Shinigami he aspired to be. He said that he wanted to change things to make the Rukanga a better place, like you were doing. In fact, that was almost the only thing I could get him to talk about for any length of time longer than a few sentences. She let out a small chuckle at the memory, but the amusement passed quickly, as she recalled how dedicated Toshiro had been. He always became annoyed in the cutest ways whenever Rangiku tried to coax some small talk out of him, but get him to speak about his duty as a Shinigami and how it was the means to achieve his dream, and his eyes started to shine with excitement and determination at the idea. In a sense, Rangiku felt a certain pride for that. She had been the one to scout the boy for a place in the Shinigami Academy, and helped him train for a time, until he had eventually surpassed her in most fields. And of course, she saw him often enough whenever she went to visit Jin to have developed a certain fondness for his lieutenant. It always felt like a sure thing, that in his future Toshiro would be able to bring a lot of good into the world, and it was hard for her not to feel as if, at least a little bit, all that good would be because of her, as well. On the other hand, the idea that she might have misjudged him so badly, failed to see that he had it in him to try and kill Jin, was quite saddening. Rangiku always thought herself a good judge of character, and she couldn't believe she had misread so badly somebody she thought she knew so well. Well, he and Hinamori are almost like brother and sister. They knew each other for a long time, since they grew up together. It's not so surprising he'd be willing to go to any extremes to save her, is it? Rangiku looked at Jin to see how much emotion he had let on his face at that, but he was still looking impassible. Still, it wasn't like he needed to spell the similarity out. She knew as well as him that she, herself, had grown up in the Rukanga alongside Jin. They shared a connection just as deep. Of course, there was a big difference, in that Rangiku didn't really see Jin as a brother. The only reason they weren't a couple was that Jin had asked her to wait on that, said he wouldn't be able to give her the full attention she deserved until he completed a goal he was very secretive about. Another woman might have thought he was trying to let her down easily, but from how he acted during the time they spent together, she didn't think so, and believed he was being honest with her. And they did spend a lot of time together, she made sure of that. Still, even with her relationship to Jin as an indication of how close together Toshiro and Momo were, Rangiku wasn't sure she could accept the idea that her asking him to would be enough to justify such an action. I guess it makes sense, in a way, but still, go so far as murder. Jin turned to her at that, his eyes opening a bit, revealing a curious expression in his light green eyes, his lips not upturned in any of the smiles he hid behind with others, but rather slightly open in surprise in a way he'd never allow himself to reveal in front of others. She always treasured the fact he only let himself so open and unguarded in her presence, which also meant she knew his surprise was genuine. You think that would be too much? She grinned, and teased him, poking his shoulder. Are you trying to say you'd kill somebody for me if I asked you to? Rangiku shook her head, chuckling at her own joke, poking Jin in the shoulder as she continued. My point was, somebody who truly cares about somebody else wouldn't ask them to kill a person for them. The point is to be there for each other's needs, not to be each other's tools. Jin smiled, but it was a soft thing, and with his eyes open and glinting, Rangiku could tell it was a true one, not one of those he felt the need to hide behind for the rest of the world. Then he said, in a thoughtful whisper. That's a fair point. He still attacked me, however. What else do you think the cause might be? She huffed, crossing her arms under her chest as she thought the matter over. I suppose Momo might have just given him a reason, and maybe he didn't want to kill you, only to give her the time to escape. Which, in Rangiku's opinion, he certainly had. Jin hadn't given her a blow-by-blow description of the battle, but when she'd asked the 4th Division members who'd been the first on the scene, they'd told her that they had just managed to drag out Toshiro from under a pile of rocks and stabilize his condition before Jin had freed himself from another pile, completely unharmed. Apparently, the entire holding area had been demolished. Rangiku knew why that might seem like an attempt to kill Jin, but knowing how much Toshiro idolized him, she wouldn't put him past the boy to have guessed that collapsing a building on him would only slow Jin down for a little bit. Still, she had to wonder what Momo could have possibly said to her little friend, to push him to do such a thing. She'd never striked her as somebody capable of plotting against Seoul society, but then, she'd never really had the chance to interact with her that much. And besides, if she had grasped the situation correctly, she was doing this only to help her friend Rukia, who apparently was consorting with known traitors like Yoryuki Shihoin and Kisokura Hara, of all people. It was all very confusing. She shook her head, and shared her opinion with Jin in an annoyed tone. I suppose friendship can create very complicated situation. He considered her words, then opined, a thoughtful expression on his face. I think it's more that relationships are complicated, and become more so as they interact with each other. That managed to get a laugh out of her, despite the situation. Oh, Jin, only you would ever think of it that way. Relationships are what makes life interesting and turn it into an adventure, them being hard to navigate is what makes things fun. It took her a few moments to collect herself, during which Jin patiently waited, used by now to her usual bouts of laughter. She wasn't sure if he realized he was the only one who could manage it consistently, but then, that was also part of his charm. Rangiku? If you're done here, we need to go. She blinked, then turned in the direction of the voice, where her captain was. The woman was looking at her from behind red oval glasses with a serious expression in her turquoise eyes, and as she tapped her foot impatiently, her long braided ponytail bounced over her shoulder in a similar rhythm. Captain Yodomaru. Is your division mobilizing to hunt the invaders, that you need your lieutenant with you? Rangiku sighed. She didn't need to check to know that Jin was back to squinting and smiling like the most self-satisfied silver fox on the planet. Lisa, for her own, was used enough to his antics that she didn't react, instead merely answering, without inflection in her voice. We are not hunting the invaders, I am merely running some drills so that my division will be ready if they should be called to intervene. I see. I can offer the services of the third, if you want a valid opponent to test yourself against. Thank you for the offer, but that will not be necessary. Besides, she nodded with her head toward the bed where Toshiro was laying. With how badly hurt your division was facing the invaders, and your lieutenant out of commission, wouldn't it be better to limit their deployment as much as possible? Jin's expression didn't change, his smirk fixed as he bowed respectfully and answered, his tone polite. Wise words, Captain Yodomaru, I shall give them the consideration they deserve. Rangiku winced, while Lisa stiffened at the implied insult. Luckily, she didn't decide to make more out of it, merely nodding and motioning for Rangiku to follow her as she left at a clipped pace. She only spoke once. They were far away enough that Jin couldn't overhear, and there was clear frustration in her tone. I still don't see what you can possibly see in that man, Ran. That was nothing new. Rangiku had known Lisa in the academy, while Jin had shot through in just 1 year. She had needed to actually learn the things they were teaching there, and in her time there, she and Lisa had struck a solid friendship, which had only grown stronger as they joined the 8th Division together. When eventually Lisa was made captain of the 10th Division, she had offered Rangiku the lieutenant position there, which she'd been glad to take, since working with a friend was something she really enjoyed. However, as close as Rangiku herself had grown to Lisa, she'd not managed to get Jin to feel the same way. He wasn't jealous of her. At least, in truth, Rangiku thought that jealousy was just not an emotion he was capable of feeling, even before he'd started shunting most of them away in his sword most of the time, but neither did he treat her any better than he treated anybody else. And Lisa, for her own, was quite the prideful person, and having to suffer Jin's treating her so badly always annoyed her. Rangiku was still not sure how to solve the issues between them, but she was sure that she would find a way to do it eventually. Still, currently wasn't the moment to try that, so instead she answered, trying to let her amusement at the constant bickering between the two keep from showing in her voice. That's just a plus for me, since it means I won't be competing with the smartest woman around, doesn't it? Lisa scoffed, but Rangiku could see she was amused, which she counted as a win. Then, because she was genuinely curious, she asked. So, if this is an operation where long-range, highly powerful attacks are required, why didn't we involve Jin? He's probably the second best person for that kind of job, after you. In truth, Rangiku was not sure whether Jin or Lisa was actually the superior sniper-type captain, but she wasn't going to tell Lisa that, it's just annoy her. As it was, her friend merely shrugged and answered. According to SWAFON, Shihoin has a personal grudge with your boyfriend, for some reason. She suspects that the woman might be spying on him, and thus is keeping him out of it to maintain operation security. She paused, then asked, clearly curious. Shouldn't you be happy? If the goddess of lightning really wants him dead, keeping him as far away from the battlefield as possible would be the best way to ensure he stays safe. In truth, Rangiku had little fear for Jin's safety, and would have felt much more reassured if he was fighting at her side, but she supposed that was a silver lining in the whole thing, if nothing else. So, she merely nodded, while focusing on the operation ahead. The invaders had done a number on both the 3rd and 11th divisions, and rumors went even defeated Mayuri, freshly promoted or not. Anybody who could beat a captain was an opponent to deal carefully with. Still, Rangiku reassured herself, even without Jin along, they were bringing enough firepower to tackle any challenge, they were not going to fail. It took about an hour of stumbling through the streets for their group to reach Hanatero's house, and once there, Renji collapsed into sleep almost immediately, the overuse of his Bankai having left him incredibly tired. When he woke up the following morning, he found that all the others were already up, with Yoriyuki motioning for everybody to meet to decide their next move. Hanataro seemed the only one to share Renji's tiredness. Ichigo's friend Sato seemed as unflappable as he always was, while Izuru was more focused and ready for it than Renji felt himself being, so soon after waking up. Once they were all reunited, Yoriyuki was the first to speak, her tone matter of fact. "I just finished my second swipe of the area, and it seems like nobody followed you here. Also, I'm keeping watch with my spiritual sense to the maximum extent my range allows, which is a couple of kilometers, and I can't sense any strong spiritual presence within that area. Which means we should be safe to plan for our next step." Renji frowned, he was sure something was missing, but it was Sato who asked first, with a frown. "What about Ichigo and the others?" Yoriyuki shook her head, her tail tapping slowly on the ground. "They're safe and sound, don't worry. I contacted Urahara, they're lying low in one of the hiding places he created back when he was a seated officer in the Omnitsukido, before he transferred to the 12th. They're shielded from detection by some devices he created, so they'll be fine there." That didn't seem to be enough to satisfy Ichigo's large friend, as he frowned. "I meant to ask why we are not waiting for them to join us in this discussion." "Oh. That's because it's not really necessary." She tapped the sheathed sword that was lying on the table next to her, and said, "My mission to retrieve Rukia's Zanpakuto was successful, and you also freed everybody from the holding cells, so, we already have all that we need to rescue her. I will scout the area around the palace with the sword to get an idea of what we're facing. Until then, making detailed plans isn't required." Renji frowned at that, feeling somewhat annoyed, and spoke up. "So, if we're not planning the assault yet, what did you made us meet up for?" "I just wanted to confirm that you all wanted to take part, and see if any of you thought they might be able to help with the scouting itself." Oh. That made sense, and, Renji realized, it really was about him, wasn't it? He let out a long and tired breath, and said, "I think my Bankai might help, since it can create the equivalent of tunnels underground that allow for instantaneous travel, although the exit points are very noticeable." Yoriyuki hummed for a moment, which sounded more like half a purr from her cat form, then answered, "I don't think that'd help me too much for the scouting, but it might make the attack easier to carry out. What about the rest of you? Anything to suggest?" Hanataro quickly shook his head, while Sato looked thoughtful for a moment before saying, "If I have enough time to study the area, I have a number of ideas that I would like to try. And I still think that Ichigo might have some ideas of his own, as well, if we got him on the discussion." Izuru tapped his fingers on the table, then commented, "I can't contribute with my abilities, but Kenpeka was the only one who saw me at the prison. It's possible he hasn't thought to speak of my involvement to anybody. I can check quietly and, if that's the case, I could try and use my role in the 3rd division to collect some information from the inside." Yoriyuki nodded, apparently happy with that. "I think those both are things we can take care of after I've done that first preliminary scouting. I better go get to it then. We only have today and tomorrow left before Rukia's execution, there's no time to lose." Everybody nodded, then the black cat was about to jump down from the table when, suddenly, Rukia's Zanpakuto started to shake lightly. Renji turned to watch it just in time to see the sword be slid out a fraction out of its scabbard by a glinting shard of metal that had been hidden in the Zanpakuto's hilt. Then, a moment later, there was a flash of pink light, and Renji could feel his heart plummeting into his stomach as an extremely familiar spiritual pressure settled over him, the power almost overwhelming. Yuriyuki shifted to her human form almost instantaneously, which caused Hanataro to take a few steps back in surprise, but the woman didn't notice. Her golden eyes focused on the unflappable figure of Captain Kukaki standing right in the middle of the room, expression neutral but sword drawn to his side. How? You might be able to discorporate using Shunpo, but I'd have sensed your Ryotsu getting close. Renji knew how, and shook his head even as he said, his voice barely a whisper. That's not Shunpo, it's the power of his Bankai. It lets him swap the position of his sword shards, and every creature touching them, with each other, and removes all range limits. Captain Kukaki nodded, raising his sword in front of himself as he elaborated, in a very neutral tone. Indeed. Between my Ho-Ho Grand Mastery and my Bankai's power, I am now faster than even you, Master Yuriyuki. The woman narrowed her glare and shot back, as she raised her hands to a guard position. You might be able to teleport all over the place, but that's not the same as being fast, little Byakuya. And you just put yourself within an enclosed space with me, a bit of lack of foresight there. Byakuya's Zanpakuto began to spread around him in a myriad of defensive petals, as he answered in a dispassionate tone. Not quite. You see, in addition to extending my control range and letting me swap place with my blades, my Bankai also does another thing, give me more than just one sword to work with. There was another flash of pink light, and suddenly, the wall of hundreds of petals was replaced by a wall of hundreds of swords, which, almost immediately, started to break apart into petals themselves, only a proportionally large amount of them, as he concluded. Which means we're not, after all, going to fight in an enclosed space at all. Now transform, Shunko. Urusei moved incredibly fast, triggering her own Bankai to turn everybody but Byakuya into ants, while turning herself into a dragonfly and accelerating in a buzzing mix of the insect natural speed and her own Ho-Ho to collect them all, in the time it took for the petals to explode like a hurricane across every visible surface, tearing apart tables and chairs, furniture, and anything over it, and even the very wall surrounding them. It was like being surrounded by a storm of death that glinted pink for a few seconds, before the petals rearranged themselves into vorticating barriers around Byakuya, at which point Yuriyuki returned the rest of them to their human size. Renji shook his head a moment to recover from the experience, and then, as a soft wind hit his face, looked around, and found that they were standing in the middle of an open street. There were houses on one side, but the one they'd before been into had simply disappeared. The only thing left was a coating of multicolored dust on the floor, which Renji realized with a shiver was all that remained of the entire house after Captain Kukaki's swords had shredded everything they could reach, and sewed no Shirayuki, which the man knelt to recover and secure at his belt with measured, relaxed movements. Yuriyuki was gritting her teeth. You might have removed all of my cover, but you're still outnumbered. You'll lose this fight. Forgetting that I can perceive everything that happens next to a shard of my blade? I was overhearing everything you said the entire time, and when the shard stopped moving, I knew your hiding place. I did not rush here unprepared. Urusei seemed about to answer, when suddenly her eyes widened and she dodged backwards. A fraction of a second later, a deep gouge appeared on the ground, as if an invisible blade had just struck it, cutting through the pavement with ease. Then it was Renji's turn to feel like a massive, invisible wrecking ball smacked onto him, smashing him to the ground. A moment later, Sato was at his side, his arm converted into the large gauntlet with shield he could create, just in time to stop 3 similarly crushing attacks with it from what, Renji realized in a moment, were merely condensed winds. The dark-skinned captain turned toward Captain Kukaki, who explained. I knew your position, and your sensory range, so I worked with Swaifo to organize a cordon at a larger distance. She is coordinating it even now, to stop you if you manage to escape me. Additionally, we asked the collaboration of captains who can fight from outside the range of your Bankai. I see, that was Yodomaru's Shikai there. Does that mean you got Jin to work with you as well? Captain Kukaki shook his head, and while his expression didn't change, his Ryotsu was filled with disdain, making its presence infusing their surroundings much more unyielding. Knowing you have a beef with him, I persuaded Swaifo not to involve him. I am here because I want answers, Yuriyuki, and it's clear I need you in irons to get them. So, surrender, or be captured, it's your choice. Renji could see that Captain Kukaki's words had hit the former 2nd Division captain. She was considering them, although from the glances she was throwing to the rest of them, it was more for their sake than herself. It took Renji a moment to understand why. She was known as the Lightning Goddess, and could probably get away by herself, but she might be unable to keep them safe. And of course, if she decided to fight, it would mean pitting them against multiple captains. Renji couldn't forget how quickly Captain Tuan had taken him down. Before he could even think to use his Bankai, he'd already been defeated, and, of course, the horror show that had been the fight with Kenpei was even fresher in his mind. There was no way they could defeat multiple ones, and as good as she was said to be, no way that Yoriuki could keep them all safe from them either. But, if she managed to escape, then not all was lost. Ichigo had proved himself surprisingly capable, Urahara was very trickery, and Momo, if motivated to save her friends, was stronger than people give her credit for. If Yoriuki escaped, they could still carry out the plan, and save Rukia. And that, to Renji, was the only thing that mattered right now. Thus, before Yoriuki could agree to Captain Kukaki's proposal, he took a step forward and said, loud and clear. Talking won't solve anything anymore, not when Rukia's already been sentenced. Lady Shihoan, the only way the others can stop the execution is you're there to help. And we can give you the time. He could both see and feel her resolve growing firm at those words, but Captain Kukaki turned toward him with just a hint of a raised eyebrow at his declaration. You think you can slow me down, Renji? We all can, together, so long as Lady Shihoan manages to escape. Roar, Zabumaru. His sword extended toward Captain Kukaki as fast as he could make it. Of course, the moment it reached the blade petals around him, it started to get shredded. But that was exactly when he had the top part explode outwards, reforming and shooting it again and again to force Captain Kukaki back. The man did, using Shunpo to step backwards, which gave Renji the time he needed to shout. And now, something I wanted to show you for some time, Captain, my Bankai. Rain, King Zabumaru. As Renji's sword transformed around him, Yoriuki darted away. Immediately, the street in front of her started to have long furrows and deep craters appear along it as condensed winds struck it, but she was switching her body between forms to help her in dodging it. Captain Kukaki spoke into a communicator, warning somebody that Yoriuki was escaping, and suddenly a giant, titanic fist slammed in front of her, cutting out her retreat for a moment. Renji recognized that as Captain Komamura's Shikai, and had to wonder how many captains exactly were cooperating on this operation. Then a swarm of metal petals shot his way, and he had to turn around his attention from what was going on with the others to focus on his own fight. He willed his snake belt to submerge underground, where it was able to move far faster than it otherwise would. He wasn't sure why his Bankai worked that way, but he took advantage of it anyway by jumping backwards, while he had the snake erupt in front of himself, and focused for a moment to make it capable of withstanding a blade's edge. The maneuver worked, and the swarm of petals bounced off the snake's body. That only stopped them for a moment, and the next pass shredded its way through, but by then Renji had put enough distance between himself and them to be able to roll out of the way of the attack. As he did, he noticed that the head of the snake that Senbonzakura had shredded, which was laying on the ground, was still reactive to his will. That he could still direct its movement wasn't so surprising in itself, since he could do that with pieces of his Shikai as well, but he realized he could make it grow more, as well. Thus, as Captain Kukaki took a step forward, he caused the snake's head to grow a body and have it wrap around the man, or, at least, he tried. As the moment the skeletal coils were around him, they found themselves holding a multitude of blade shards instead, although only for a moment before the metal petals shredded the skeleton into bone dust. The petals used for the substitution, Renji realized as he felt Captain Kukaki pressure suddenly spike upwards right next himself, were those that he'd just dodged. As he turned, Captain Kukaki was there, sword raised, blade shards erupting it like a cutting blast that glinted pink in the morning light. Renji willed his blade to curve in front of himself to parry, but he knew even that wouldn't be enough, which was when, to his own surprise, the red fur surrounding his torso started to grow on his own, engulfing most of his body for a moment, and he realized he could channel his will through it, since that, too, was a piece of his sword after all. It was just for a moment, since it was taxing on his mind to focus only on cutting through things, but he gave the fur an edge, bouncing off the sword petals once more, even though the strength of being smacked in the chest by them pushed him backwards. As he took a breath to stabilize himself, the fur went back to its normal size. He frowned, as he tried to focus on how exactly he had made it grow before, so that he could replicate the process. Captain Kukaki immediately noticed, as he commented, in a critical tone. "You have not yet mastered all that your Bankai can do, Renji, isn't that correct?" "I know. I'm working on getting better at it, it's not a very intuitive ability." The man shook his head, and Renji could feel the disappointment suffusing the riot that was surrounding them. "As usual, your natural talent is great, but your laziness prevents you from reaching your full potential." The scolding let Renji frustrated, a frequent experience when dealing with his captain, and he shouted back. "I've not had the time to train it properly. If you planned on challenging me, you should have made time." And with those scathing words, the man sent a wave of glinting petals charging at Renji again. He swung Zabumaru, letting 2 copies of its body shot forward and get in the way of the attack even as his snake belt burrowed underground and then emerged behind him. The blade petals still reached him and started to cut away even as he jumped backward, but as he hit the enlarged skeletal snake and was absorbed within, he could feel the Zanpakuto healing those wounds away. He was about to emerge, when he suddenly paused, realizing he had the perfect chance to counter-attack without being targeted by the petals. Thus, he reformed and split apart his snake belt multiple times, making each one grow to huge proportions, before he caused multiple of them to erupt from the ground, immediately diving back in and emerging again, forming a large set of skeletal loops around Captain Kukaki, with the huge skeleton heads looming from above. The man looked around himself with a bored expression, the swarms of blade petals around him slowly growing in number even as they spiraled all around the captain in a defensive pattern. He spoke idly, even as his gaze moved slowly from one skeletal snake to the next. "You think this will take me down?" Renji didn't answer, instead commanding all of the vertebrae composing each snake to explode, flying toward Captain Kukaki at once. The swarm around him, glinting pink as the petals caught the light, engulfed the man completely, and just before the bone projectiles smacked onto it, Renji charged them with the power to cut through. However, this time, Captain Kukaki was ready for it, and matched it with his own, the effect so powerful that Renji could feel the sense of dread even underground. For a moment, he hoped that the clashing blades would bounce out of each other, but it took only a fraction of a moment for it to become clear that the cutting edge of the many shards of Senbonzakura had been made far sharper than that of Zabumaru, as the metal petals cut straight through the bone, shredding it all out to dust. Then, before Renji had time to order them to do anything else or move, the petals expanded in a swirling vortex at high speed, and every other remaining piece of the skeleton snakes was shredded, including the snakes' heads. Which was a problem, since Renji was using their eyes to see where Captain Kukaki was. He tried to push more skeleton snakes out of the ground to organize a new attacks, but whenever he did, they were destroyed before they could even emerge. It took him a moment to realize that the blade petals were hovering just above ground level and constantly rushing around, shredding anything that tried to emerge out of the ground. Which made it impossible to know what Captain Kukaki was doing, and, Renji realized with a start, meant that he could go after Yoryuki at any time. He had to keep the man here, so he had to get back outside, and somehow without getting shredded as he did so. Before he could figure out a way to do that, though, Captain Kukaki suddenly spiked, and then the ground all around him suddenly exploded again and again, in a repeating chain reaction that, he realized, was the result of single shards being replaced by whole swords that were then replaced by an equal volume of blade petals that were then replaced by an equal number of sword, the back and forth, resulting in the complete destruction of everything around him. When the destruction finally stopped, Renji found himself standing in a large crater, surrounded by a multitude of swords suspended in the air around it like a cage, with a sea of blade petals swirling throughout the area as if carried by wind, and with Captain Kukaki standing in the middle. The man's pressure filled the area, and it seemed like he'd let out far more of it than normal, as Renji was having trouble breathing, something which rarely happened. Captain Kukaki, on the other hand, had no problem speaking. "I would have expected you of all people, Renji, would have known that striking at me from hiding is pointless. I am disappointed in you." Renji grimaced at that, but then forced himself to refocus, using the sword in his hand to strike forward while his snake belt went to burrow underground again. However, Captain Kukaki suddenly disappeared, reforming right next to him, sword already swinging. Renji was left with barely any time to react, and even as he tried to, the Ryotsu in the air, already very dense and heavy, was filled with disdain, turning as unyielding as steel. As a result, Renji's reactions were completely incapable of stopping the captain's swing, and just upon hitting him, Senbonzakura segmented, each fragment shredding his insides along the path of the swing. He collapsed to the ground, and without his regeneration, which was already kicked in, he knew an attack like that would have killed him. And, with his spine broken, the pressure filled with disdain that he was surrounded by suddenly turned into a crushing weight impossible to bear. Even with all of his strength, Renji could barely move, and he suddenly realized the weight was actively hindering his recovery, as it kept grinding down the not fully reformed bones and pushed them out of alignment. As he tried to push his regeneration through it, the pressure reacted, as if targeting specifically the places he was focusing on, as if guided by an intelligent will. Which, he realized as he heard the steps of Captain Kukaki getting closer to him at an unhurried pace, it was. The man didn't kneel, but he did lower himself to be able to be more easily heard as he spoke. You know how good my control over myself is, Renji, and how that translates to full control over how my Ryotsu manifest itself. Your resistance is futile, but if you are mature enough to recognize it and surrender now, I will plead for mercy on your behalf. Renji gritted his teeth, and refused to let go. Any second he spent fighting was 1 second more for Yoriyuki to escape the trap and bring the chances of saving Rukia a little bit higher. As he redoubled his efforts, Captain Kukaki's eyebrows raised very slightly in surprise, and then suddenly the pressure inside Renji was burning him with anger, then freezing him with fear, pushing him down on the ground with repulsion, and then crushing him against it with disdain, the swap between emotions so fast that it added to the damage each time it happened. He was left with almost no breath, his struggling regeneration the only thing keeping him alive, and he could see Captain Kukaki leaving, in a sudden surge of anger and determination, which he realized a moment later had unconsciously activated his Hakuda. His hand snapped out, closing around Captain Kukaki's heel, and stopping the man's progress. Even with his determination keeping his arm together, he could feel the muscles underneath ripping from the effort, and had to let out a scream of pain at it. Captain Kukaki half-turned, gazing dismissively at him from above his shoulder. With blood coming out his mouth at every word, Renji managed to say, his throat burning with effort. Why, Captain? If you stop us, Rukia will die. Uncharacteristically, the man let out a long sigh, and he answered, his tone exceptionally mild. If we use our positions to ignore the laws, Renji, then what value either of them has? As a Shinigami, you should know the truth of this. As a noble, it is even more so. I don't want Rukia to die, but she has been condemned by our law. To save her would be to destroy Soul Society. I am not so egoistic as to put my personal wishes above the good of everyone. Renji wanted to argue, to explain the captain why he was so wrong, how letting the law kill somebody innocent was evil, but before he could, the pressure slammed onto him again filled with astounding determination, shattering his wrist so that he was forced to let go of the man's heel. Then, the pain became simply too much, and Renji passed out, the sight of Captain Kukaki walking away from him the last thing he saw. Check the description for the links to the author.